Hello there and welcome to Before Memory Channel. Tonight, we leave the modern world behind to find rest in the deep, wooden heartbeat of a merchant ship. Close your eyes and feel the rhythmic groan of 18th century timber as we drift across a restless Atlantic. You are suspended in a hempen hammock, surrounded by the scent of salt and the flicker of low lantern light. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists only at sea. Not the darkness of a closed room, where the eyes adjust and shapes return. Not the darkness of a forest at midnight, where the canopy still admits a needle of starlight. This is a darkness with no edges, no walls, no familiar shapes to hold on to. A darkness that begins at the ship's rail and continues, unbroken, for 3,000 miles in every direction. Somewhere inside that darkness, in the year 1750, a wooden hull no longer than a modern city bus carried perhaps 30 or 40 human beings across the widest ocean on Earth, and not one of them was sleeping easily. Picture it. A merchant ship, perhaps 100 feet from bow to stern, groaning through black water under a press of canvas the crew cannot fully see, only hear the deep, percussive snap of a topsail catching wind, the constant low moan of rigging under strain, a sound sailors of the era often compared to a living thing breathing through its sleep. Below decks, in a space with barely enough headroom to stand upright, men lie in canvas hammocks slung so close together that a sleeper's shoulder brushes his neighbor's with every roll of the hull. The air down there is thick, thick with the smell of bilge water, tar, unwashed wool, and the faint sourness of a barrel of salt pork 3 weeks into its voyage. Somewhere above, a ship's bell rings out into the night, marking time the only way these men have to measure it, and for a moment, in the brief silence between the bell's last note and the next gust of wind, the question that should occupy every viewer of this story rises to the surface. What was it actually like to lie awake in that blackness, in that ocean, in that century, fully aware that nothing but a few inches of oak stood between you and an abyss that swallowed ships whole and never gave them back? This is not a story about a single famous voyage, or a single named ship, or a single extraordinary disaster. It is something quieter and, in its way, more honest than that, a reconstruction, built from the surviving logbooks, sailors' journals, ship manifests, court records, and maritime histories of the 18th century, of an ordinary night aboard an ordinary Atlantic merchantman. Because the truth is, the ordinary nights were the ones that defined this experience for the hundreds of thousands of people who made this crossing, the sailors who did it for a living, and the merchants, emigrants, and indentured servants who did it once, for reasons that would change the entire course of their lives. Tonight, we are going to live through one of those nights with them. Slowly, honestly, from the first gray light of an ordinary evening at sea to the moment, hours later, when dawn finally breaks over an ocean that, for one more night, did not take what it was owed. To understand why sleep itself became such a fragile, hard-won thing aboard these vessels, we first have to understand the world that put these ships on the water in the first place, and the strange, dangerous, almost unimaginable gamble that an Atlantic crossing represented to the people who undertook it. By the middle of the 18th century, the Atlantic Ocean had become the central artery of an entire economic civilization. Ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and London on one side of the water and Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston on the other were bound together by a constant, churning traffic of merchant vessels carrying manufactured goods, tools, textiles, and furniture westward, and returning eastward loaded with tobacco, sugar, timber, furs, and grain. This was not occasional trade. By the 1750s, thousands of merchant voyages were crossing the Atlantic every year, carrying cargo, correspondence, news, and people, and it is easy, looking back from an age of jet travel, to forget just how strange and total a commitment that journey was. A letter sent from London to Philadelphia did not arrive in hours, or even days. It arrived in weeks, if it arrived at all, carried in the same wooden hold as crates of nails and bolts of cloth, subject to the same storms, the same delays, the same possibility of simply vanishing into the sea. A typical westbound crossing, fighting against prevailing winds and currents, could take anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, sometimes longer, if the weather turned against a ship for any extended stretch. Eastbound voyages, riding the same winds that had fought the outbound ships, were often faster, sometimes completed in a month. But there was no guarantee of either. A voyage's length depended on wind, weather, the skill of the captain, the condition of the hull, and 100 variables no one aboard could control. People boarding a merchant ship in Bristol in, say, April, genuinely did not know whether they would set foot on solid ground again in June or in August, or at all. And once that ship cleared the harbor and the coastline sank below the horizon, every person aboard crossed an invisible threshold. There would be no turning back. No letters home until landfall. No way to summon help if something went wrong. For the length of the voyage, the ship was not simply a means of transportation. It was the entire world, a self-contained universe of wood and rope and canvas, and everyone aboard it was utterly, completely alone with whatever the ocean decided to do. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. In the modern world, we are almost never truly beyond reach. There is always somewhere a phone signal, a road, a rescue service, a sense, even if illusory, that help exists and could theoretically arrive. The people aboard an 18th century merchant ship had no such illusion. Once the land disappeared, it disappeared completely, and there was nothing to do but trust the ship, trust the crew, trust the captain's reading of the stars and the compass, and wait. That waiting, stretched across 6, 8, 10 weeks, is where our story truly begins. Not with a single dramatic night, but with the slow, grinding accumulation of nights just like it, each one a small test of nerve that the body and mind had to pass before they were allowed, finally, to rest. To understand that test of nerve, we have to step aboard the ship itself and look closely at the wooden world that would hold every fear, every hope, and every breath of these passengers and crew for the length of the crossing. A typical mid-18th century merchant vessel making the Atlantic run was small by any modern standard, often somewhere between 80 and 130 feet in length, with a beam or width of perhaps 25 feet. Ships of this kind went by several names depending on their rigging, snow, brig, ship-rigged merchantmen, but their internal structure followed a fairly consistent logic, one dictated less by comfort than by the brutal arithmetic of cargo space. Every foot of hull that did not carry goods was, from the owner's perspective, wasted foot of hull. Human beings, whether crew or paying passengers, were squeezed into whatever space remained once the holds were packed with barrels, crates, and bales. Below the upper deck lay the main deck, often partially given over to cargo and the larger pieces of ship's equipment, with the crew's living quarters, the forecastle, pronounced by sailors as focsle, crammed into the bow, the narrowest, most cramped, and most violently pitching part of the entire vessel. It was here, in the forecastle, that the common sailors slept, ate, and spent what little leisure time their grueling watch schedule allowed. Headroom rarely exceeded 5.5 feet, forcing grown men to stoop or crouch whenever they moved through the space. Hammocks, canvas slings suspended from the deck beams above, were the standard sleeping arrangement, not because they were comfortable, but because they were practical. A hammock swayed with the roll of the ship rather than throwing its occupant against a hard bunk frame, and it could be slung close enough to its neighbors that a dozen men could sleep in a space that would barely have held half that number of fixed beds. Sailors typically owned their own hammocks and bedding, rolling them up and stowing them by day to clear space for work. Beneath the main deck, often accessible only by a steep ladder or a narrow companionway, lay the orlop deck and the hold's dark, low-ceiling spaces that housed the bulk of the cargo, the ship's stores of food and water, and, on passenger-carrying voyages, the berths of the emigrants and indentured servants making the crossing. These spaces saw almost no natural light. A single lantern, its flame jealously guarded against the omnipresent risk of fire aboard a wooden ship soaked in tar and pitch, might be the only illumination for an entire compartment. The air here was the worst on the ship, a stagnant mixture of bilge water, which collected in the very bottom of the hull and had to be pumped out regularly, mixed with the smell of whatever cargo surrounded the passengers. Salted fish, tobacco, raw wool, tar, and the inevitable, creeping odor of human bodies confined together for weeks without adequate washing facilities. Above all of this sat the quarterdeck, the captain's domain, and his cabin, modest by later standards, but a private luxury beyond imagining for anyone berthed below. The captain alone, and perhaps the ship's mates and the surgeon if one was carried, enjoyed anything resembling private quarters. Everyone else lived, ate, slept, and worked in close, constant, unavoidable proximity to dozens of other human beings, day and night, for the length of the voyage. This physical arrangement was not an accident of poor planning. It was a direct reflection of the strict, almost military hierarchy that governed life aboard every merchant vessel of the period, and that hierarchy is essential to understanding how a single sleepless night actually unfolded, because every person aboard experienced that night differently, depending entirely on where they stood within it. At the top of this small floating society stood the captain or master, who held near total authority over the ship and everyone on it for the duration of the voyage. His decisions on navigation, discipline, and the handling of any crisis were final, and his judgment, built from years, often decades, of experience reading wind, weather, and water, was quite literally the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. Beneath him served the mates, typically a first and second mate, who oversaw the watches, supervised the crew's work, and were trained to navigate and command the vessel themselves if the captain became incapacitated. The boatswain, responsible for the ship's rigging, sails, and anchors, and often the man who relayed the captain's orders to the crew through the ship's signature shrill whistle known as a call, ranked below the mates but above the common sailors. The ship's carpenter, and on larger or longer voyaging vessels a surgeon, rounded out the specialized crew, each carrying skills the ship could not survive without. Below these stood the able seamen, experienced sailors who could hand, reef, and steer, meaning they could work the sails, climb the rigging in any weather, and take their turn at the helm, and the ordinary seamen, less experienced hands still learning their trade. At the very bottom of this hierarchy stood the ship's boys, often as young as 10 or 12 years old, apprenticed to the sea, who performed the dirtiest, most menial tasks aboard and slept in whatever corner of the forecastle nobody else claimed. On voyages carrying passengers, emigrants seeking a new life in the American colonies, indentured servants bound by contract to years of labor in exchange for their passage, merchants traveling to conduct business in person. An entirely separate social layer existed alongside the ship's crew, occupying the worst, most cramped spaces below decks, paying for the privilege with money they often could not spare or with years of their future freedom signed away in a contract. These passengers had no role in running the ship, no claim to the crew's attention beyond what basic care their fare entitled them to, and no real understanding, in most cases, of the dangers their captain and crew navigated nightly on their behalf. For them, more than for anyone else aboard, the darkness of an Atlantic night was an experience of pure, helpless dependency, trusting their lives entirely to strangers and to a wooden hull they had no power to control. It is into this world, this stratified, crowded, wooden microcosm balanced on an indifferent ocean, that we now descend, to meet the people who lived it. Imagine, for a moment, that you could walk the length of this ship on the evening our story takes place, not as a passenger or crew member, but as something closer to a quiet, invisible witness, free to move from the captain's cabin to the depths of the hold without being seen. What you would find is not a single experience of the Atlantic crossing, but dozens of overlapping, simultaneous ones, each shaped by rank, by duty, by fear, and by what each person aboard stood to gain or lose at the end of this journey. In his cabin, lit by a single swinging lantern, the captain bends over a chart spread across a small table, weighting its curling corners with whatever objects are at hand. He has likely commanded ships for years, possibly decades, working his way up from ship's boy to able seaman to mate before finally earning a command of his own. A path that, in this era, depended as much on demonstrated skill and survival as on connections or capital. Tonight, his concern is not abstract. He has been watching the sky for hours, noting a particular quality to the clouds on the western horizon. A slight, almost imperceptible shift in the wind that experience has taught him to take seriously. He cannot consult a forecast. There is no forecast. There is only what his eyes, his skin, and 30 years of accumulated instinct tell him about what the next few hours might bring. He will not sleep well tonight, and not because his bunk is uncomfortable. 2 decks below, in the forecastle, an able seaman. We can imagine him in his late 20s, his hands permanently roughened and scarred from years of rope work, a few fingers slightly crooked from old injuries that were simply allowed to heal as best they could. Lies in his hammock between watches, doing the thing every experienced sailor learned to do out of pure necessity: sleeping in fragments. The watch system aboard most merchant vessels divided the ship's company into 2 groups, larboard and starboard watches, each standing duty for 4 hours at a time around the clock, with a few shortened dog watches in the early evening designed to rotate which men stood the worst hours on subsequent nights. This meant that no sailor aboard ever slept a full, uninterrupted night at sea. For hours on deck, exposed to wind, spray, and cold, regardless of the hour or the weather. Then 4 hours below to eat, rest, and sleep as quickly and completely as the body could manage, before the bosun's call summoned them back to the deck again. Our able seaman has done this so many times that his body now wakes itself, almost to the minute, before the bell even rings. Tonight, though, something is different. He noticed the same shift in the wind the captain noticed. He has felt it before on other voyages, and what came after was rarely pleasant. Nearby, curled into the smallest, least desirable corner of the forecastle, a ship's boy, perhaps 11 years old, perhaps the son of a sailor, perhaps an orphan apprentice to the sea because it was the only trade available to him, sleeps the deep, total sleep that only the very young and the very exhausted can manage, undisturbed for the moment by the same wind that troubles his elders, his small body having worked a full 8 or 10 hours of labor that day, hauling rope, fetching food, and water for the men, scrubbing the deck, emptying slop buckets, and absorbing, without complaint, the rough good humor and occasional cruelty of older sailors testing whether he had what it took to survive a life at sea. Down in the hold, in the cramped, foul-smelling space allotted to paying passengers, a different kind of wakefulness reigns. Here we find, perhaps, a family of emigrants, a husband, wife, and 2 children, who sold what little land or trade they had to afford passage to the American colonies, drawn by the promise of cheap land and a fresh start, a promise carried home in letters from relatives who had crossed before them. They have been at sea for 5 weeks already. The children, after an initial period of terror and seasickness, have adapted with the startling resilience of childhood, but the parents have not. The wife lies awake beside her sleeping husband, listening to the ship's timbers groan, doing the arithmetic of fear that every passenger eventually does. Calculating how many weeks remain, how much of their carefully rationed food and water is left, what they will do if illness strikes one of the children, what they will do if it does not stop here, if the wind that is rising right now does not pass, but builds, the way she has heard sailors say it sometimes does, into something far worse. Beside this family, perhaps, lies a young man traveling alone, his passage paid not in coin but in a signed indenture, a legal contract binding him to several years of unpaid labor for whoever purchases that contract upon arrival in the colonies. He is leaving behind a life in England that offered him nothing. No land, no trade prospects, no future beyond what his father had, which was very little. He does not know yet who will buy his contract, what kind of master he will serve, or what conditions await him on the other side of this ocean. For him, the darkness of this particular night is layered with a different kind of fear. Not simply of the sea, but of everything waiting beyond it, in a country he has never seen, among people he does not know, bound by a piece of paper he signed in a moment of desperation he is only now beginning to fully understand the weight of. And finally, alone at the helm on the windward side of the quarterdeck, a single sailor grips the great wooden wheel, his eyes fixed not on any visible horizon. There is none tonight, only an absolute featureless black, but on the small, dimly lit compass card mounted just ahead of him, the one fragile, flickering point of reference that tells him, and through him the entire ship, which way is forward. He has been at the helm for nearly an hour of his watch already, fighting a wheel that fights back with every swell, and he will stand here for 3 more hours before another man relieves him, alone with the wind, the dark, and the strange, hypnotic responsibility of being, for this small slice of time, the single human hand steering 30 or 40 lives across an ocean that does not know or care that they exist. This is the ship, then, on the night our story unfolds. Not one story, but many, layered on top of each other in the dark, each person aboard carrying their own private weight of fear, duty, hope, and exhaustion. All of them bound together by the same wooden hull, the same wind, and the same uncertain hours that stretch ahead of them until dawn. To understand why this particular night feels different to so many of these people, we have to go back several weeks, to the morning this voyage began, because the experience of a long Atlantic crossing was never just about a single night. It was about an accumulation, a slow erosion of certainty, comfort, and ease that began the moment the ship left harbor and only deepened with every week that followed. Departure day, for most passengers, had been a chaos of noise and motion entirely unlike the silence that surrounds them now. The docks of a port like Bristol or Liverpool in the mid-18th century were themselves a kind of controlled bedlam. Forests of masts crowding the harbor, the shouts of stevedores loading cargo, the cries of gulls wheeling overhead, the creak of cranes lowering barrels and crates into waiting holds, and threading through all of it, the passengers themselves. Families saying final goodbyes to relatives who would not see them again for years, if ever, indentured servants reporting to the ship's agent to have their contracts checked against the manifest, sailors signing on for the voyage and receiving a small advance against their wages, much of which would already be spent or owed before the ship even cleared the harbor mouth. For the family of emigrants we met in the hold, departure day had carried a strange, vertiginous mixture of grief and hope. They had said goodbye to parents, siblings, and a way of life they understood completely, in exchange for a future they could only imagine secondhand, through the optimistic letters of relatives already settled in the colonies. The husband had likely sold tools, furniture, perhaps a small plot of land, converting a lifetime's accumulation into the fare for 4 passages and whatever modest sum they would need to establish themselves on the other side. There was no insurance against the voyage failing, no refund if the ship was lost. The entire family's future had been loaded, quite literally, into the hold of this single wooden vessel, alongside their trunk of clothing and the few household items they had judged worth the cost of bringing. The first days at sea, for nearly every passenger making their first ocean voyage, were dominated by a single, miserable, universal experience: seasickness. The unfamiliar, constant motion of a ship under sail, the rise and fall, the roll from side to side, the corkscrew twist that came when wind and waves struck the hull at certain angles, overwhelmed the inner ear and stomach of almost everyone unaccustomed to it. Sailors' journals and passenger accounts from this era describe these first days with a kind of rueful consistency. Passengers too ill to eat, too ill to move from their berths, retching into whatever container was at hand in spaces with no real ventilation and no real privacy, the smell of sickness mixing with the existing odors of bilge and tar to create an atmosphere that, for the first week or so, made the entire below-decks experience almost unbearable for anyone not yet adapted to life at sea. Most passengers found their sea legs, as sailors called it, within a week to 10 days, the body's remarkable capacity to adjust to even the most disorienting new circumstances eventually winning out. But those first days left a residue of vulnerability and fear that never entirely disappeared, even once the nausea passed. By the 3rd or 4th week, a kind of routine had settled over the ship, the particular rhythm that long voyages eventually impose on everyone aboard them. Passengers had learned which hours brought relative quiet on the crowded lower deck, which corners offered the least foul air, how to ration the small comforts they had brought aboard. A bit of dried fruit, a favorite blanket, a book, if they could read, passed hand to hand among those who could not. The crew, for their part, had long since settled into the unbroken cycle of 4-hour watches that would govern their entire waking and sleeping life until landfall, a rhythm so demanding that experienced sailors often described their body's relationship to time at sea as fundamentally different from time on land, measured not in hours and days, but in watches and bells, in the position of the sun, and in the particular quality of light that told an experienced eye whether dawn or dusk was approaching. And it was in this stretch of the voyage, past the initial shock of departure, past the worst of the seasickness, but still weeks from the relief of landfall, that the accumulated fatigue of the crossing began to weigh most heavily on everyone aboard. The novelty had worn off. The optimism of departure day had faded into the long, grinding reality of weeks upon weeks of confinement, poor food, foul air, and constant uncertainty. It was in this stretch of the voyage, in fact, that our particular night takes place. Roughly the 5th week of a crossing expected to last 8, with the ship somewhere in the open Atlantic, days from any sight of land in either direction, utterly dependent on wind, water, and the skill of the men charged with bringing everyone aboard safely to the other side. It was also, by this point in the voyage, that the question of food and water, abstract concerns on departure day, had become a daily, physical reality that touched every person aboard, and it is to that reality we turn next, because what these people ate, and increasingly what they had stopped being able to eat, shaped the night that was now closing in around them as profoundly as any storm. Food aboard an 18th-century merchant ship was governed by a single, unforgiving constraint. Nothing could be allowed to spoil before the voyage ended, because there was no possibility of resupply once the ship left port. Every meal eaten in week 5 had to have survived the same 5 weeks of heat, damp, and the constant gnawing attention of rats and insects that infested every wooden ship of the era, no matter how well kept. The foundation of the diet, for crew and passengers alike, was ship's biscuit, sometimes called hardtack. A simple, dense cracker made from flour, water, and a little salt, baked hard enough and dry enough to survive for months without spoiling. By week 5 of a voyage, however, surviving did not mean remaining pleasant. Weevils, small grain beetles whose larvae infested flour and biscuit stores almost universally on long voyages, had typically established themselves throughout the ship's bread supply by this point in any crossing of meaningful length. Sailors developed a grim, practical routine around this fact, tapping a biscuit against the table or a barrel head before eating it, to dislodge as many of the insects as possible, and then eating what remained without much further comment, because the alternative was not eating at all. This was not exaggeration or folklore. It is recorded consistently across sailors' accounts and ships' records of the period as one of the ordinary, expected features of life at sea, an inconvenience so universal it barely warranted comment in most journals. Alongside the biscuit, the ship stores typically included salted beef and salted pork, preserved in heavy brine within wooden barrels stowed in the hold. This salt meat required soaking before it could be cooked, to draw out enough of the salt to make it edible, and even then it remained tough, stringy, and a far cry from fresh meat, but it provided protein that would otherwise have been entirely absent from the shipboard diet. Dried peas, oatmeal, and a thick, simple cake of flour and suet known by various names depending on the ship's nationality and tradition rounded out the typical fare, supplemented, when supplies allowed, by whatever fish the crew managed to catch over the side. Water presented an even more pressing concern than food, because water, stored in wooden casks for weeks at a time, developed its own problems, growing increasingly foul, often discolored, sometimes slimy with algae growth inside the cask, and rationed with real strictness as a voyage extended into its later weeks, particularly if contrary winds had delayed the crossing beyond its expected length. Many ships carried beer or a weak alcoholic drink as part of the daily ration, in part because the alcohol content, modest as it was, helped suppress the growth of the bacteria that made standing water dangerous to drink, a practical solution to a problem the era understood only empirically, through accumulated experience without fully grasping the underlying microbiology. This diet, heavy in salt and starch, almost entirely lacking in fresh fruit or vegetables, carried within it a danger that the 18th century was only beginning to understand. Scurvy, a disease caused by prolonged vitamin C deficiency, which became an increasing threat the longer any voyage extended without access to fresh provisions. By the 1740s, ship's surgeon James Lind had conducted his now well-documented experiments demonstrating that citrus fruit could treat and prevent scurvy. But this knowledge spread slowly and unevenly through the maritime world, and most ordinary merchant vessels of the mid-18th century had no systematic practice of carrying citrus to prevent it. On a voyage of 6 to 10 weeks, full-blown scurvy was less common than on the much longer voyages of naval and exploratory vessels. But the early symptoms, particularly toward the later weeks of a longer-than-expected crossing, were a real and recognized danger. A creeping lethargy, swollen and bleeding gums, small bruises appearing without cause, and old wounds and scars beginning, alarmingly, to reopen, a symptom sailors of the era had observed and feared without fully understanding why it occurred. For the family in the hold, this reality had become an unwelcome part of their daily life by the 5th week of the voyage. The dried fruit they had brought aboard, a small private store the wife had packed with exactly this danger in mind, having heard warnings from neighbors who had made the crossing before her, was nearly gone, carefully rationed out a few pieces at a time to the children, whom she watched now with the particular, low-grade anxiety of a parent counting days against a dwindling resource. The husband had begun, in the last week, to notice his own gums felt tender in a way they never had before, a small, private worry he had not yet voiced aloud, not wanting to add to his wife's burden of fear with one more thing to carry through the dark. It is against this backdrop, bodies already weakened by weeks of poor diet, nerves already worn thin by confinement and uncertainty, sleep already fractured by the demands of the watch system or the discomfort of a crowded berth, that the particular night of our story now begins, as the sun, somewhere beyond the thick gray clouds gathering on the western horizon, starts its long, slow descent toward the sea. Dusk at sea arrives differently than dusk on land. There are no trees to lose their detail first, no buildings to fade into silhouette one by one. Instead, the entire visible world, sky and water both, seems to dim at once, in a slow, uniform surrender of color, until the horizon itself, the single line that has organized every sailor's sense of space and direction all day, simply dissolves. On this particular evening, that dissolution comes early and abruptly, hastened by the bank of dense gray cloud that has been building in the west since mid-afternoon, swallowing the sunset before it can properly begin, leaving behind only a dull, bruised orange glow low on the horizon before even that fades into uniform dark. On deck, the change of the evening watch unfolds with the same practiced choreography it follows every night of the voyage. The bosun's call pierces the air, a sharp, rising whistle that carries clearly even over the wind, summoning the relief watch up from below. Men climb the companionway in twos and threes, blinking against the wind, pulling oilskin jackets tighter against a damp chill that has sharpened noticeably in the last hour. The outgoing watch passes brief, practical information to the incoming one. The ship's heading, any sail changes made during the previous 4 hours, the captain's standing orders for the night. An exchange of perhaps 30 seconds that nonetheless carries the full weight of responsibility for the ship passing from one set of hands to another. Then the relieved men disappear below, already half asleep on their feet, while the fresh watch spreads out to their stations. Lookouts to the bow and the rigging, men to the braces that control the angle of the sails, one man to the helm, and the officer of the watch pacing the windward side of the quarterdeck, alone with the ship's heading and his own private calculations. Below decks, in the forecastle, the relieved watch eats a hurried, simple meal by the light of a single shielded lantern. Biscuit, perhaps a portion of the day's salt meat, washed down with a ration of small beer, before climbing into hammocks still warm from whoever last occupied them. The constant rotation of bodies through the same limited sleeping space leaving little room for anything resembling true privacy or stillness. Within minutes, most of these men are asleep, a skill every experienced sailor eventually masters out of pure necessity. The ability to drop into deep, immediate sleep the instant the opportunity presents itself, because no one knows how long that opportunity will last. In the hold, the passengers have settled into their own version of this nightly ritual. The family of emigrants has eaten their modest evening meal. Biscuit softened slightly in water, a small portion of the salt meat the wife has been carefully soaking since morning, and now the children lie curled together under a single shared blanket, the younger one already asleep, lulled by an exhaustion that the day's confined boredom somehow still manages to produce. The husband lies beside them, eyes open in the near-total dark, listening. The wife sits a moment longer, mending a small tear in one of the children's garments by feel more than sight, her hands moving through a familiar task that offers, if not comfort exactly, then at least the small mercy of occupation. It is in this quiet, settling hour, the ship's company sorted into watches and berths, the passengers folding themselves into whatever rest the cramped hold allows, the evening's routine completed exactly as it has been completed every night for 5 weeks, that the first genuinely unfamiliar note enters the night. The wind, which has held fairly steady from the southwest for the past 2 days, begins to shift and to build. Not dramatically, not yet, just a slight freshening, a slight backing in direction, the kind of change that an inexperienced ear would never notice and an experienced one notices immediately, the way a person who has lived beside a particular river for years can hear, in the changed pitch of the water, that rain has fallen somewhere upstream. On the quarterdeck, the officer of the watch feels it too. A subtle increase in the pressure of the wind against his cheek, a new edge to its sound in the rigging, and glances instinctively toward the place where the horizon should be, though there is nothing to see there now but unbroken dark. He has stood enough watches, weathered enough Atlantic nights, to know that this particular kind of change rarely means nothing. He does not yet wake the captain. There is nothing concrete enough yet to report, nothing that justifies disturbing the only man aboard whose judgment, if a real crisis develops, will matter more than anyone else's. But he orders a slight reduction in sail regardless. A precaution, nothing more, the kind of small, almost reflexive caution that separates officers who bring their ships home from officers who do not, and settles back into his pacing, watching, waiting, while behind him, below decks, in hammocks and berths scattered through the length of the hull, 30-odd human beings drift toward whatever sleep the night will allow them, none of them yet aware that the wind has begun, very quietly, to change its mind. To understand why a slight shift in the wind could trouble an experienced officer so deeply, even before any storm had announced itself, we need to understand something many people today simply take for granted. In the middle of the 18th century, no one aboard this ship could know, with real precision, exactly where on the ocean they were. This is one of the most difficult facts for a modern audience to fully absorb, accustomed as we are to instant, satellite-perfect location on a device in our pocket. But for an 18th century navigator, determining a ship's position at sea was an ongoing exercise in careful observation, mathematics, and educated estimation. A practice called dead reckoning, which formed the backbone of maritime navigation throughout this era. Dead reckoning worked by combining several pieces of information, tracked meticulously hour by hour: the ship's compass heading, which direction it had been sailing; its speed, measured using a device called a log line, a length of knotted rope attached to a wooden float, paid out over the stern and timed against a small sandglass, with the number of knots that passed through a sailor's hands in a fixed interval giving the ship's speed in the unit we still call knots today, and the time elapsed since the last known position, tracked using the ship's bells and a set of sandglasses turned faithfully every half hour, day and night, by whichever sailor stood that watch. From these three pieces of information, direction, speed, and time, a navigator could calculate, with reasonable but imperfect accuracy, how far the ship had traveled and in what direction since its last confirmed position, and plot an estimated new position on the chart. Latitude, the ship's position north or south, could be checked with real precision by measuring the angle of the sun at local noon or of certain stars at night, using an instrument such as a quadrant or, increasingly by mid-century, the newer and more accurate octant. But longitude, the ship's position east or west, the measurement that would tell a captain exactly how far across the Atlantic he had actually traveled, remained, for most ordinary merchant captains of this period, essentially impossible to determine with precision. The marine chronometer, the instrument that would eventually solve this problem by allowing navigators to compare local time to a fixed reference time and calculate longitude directly, had only recently been developed by John Harrison in England, and would not become standard equipment on ordinary merchant vessels for several more decades. Until then, longitude remained a matter of careful, cumulative estimation, dead reckoning, refined and corrected whenever land or another identifiable landmark came into view, but otherwise simply trusted, hour after hour, day after day, across thousands of miles of open water. This means that the captain of our ship on this particular night knows his approximate position only through 5 weeks of accumulated calculation. A long, unbroken chain of compass headings, log line readings, and careful arithmetic, any single link of which, if compromised by an unnoticed current, an uncorrected compass error, or simply human fatigue and mistake, could throw the entire estimate off by miles, sometimes by tens of miles, without anyone aboard having any way to know it until land, or another ship, finally appeared to confirm or contradict the chart. It is a sobering thought that the only thing standing between this vessel and a navigational error of potentially serious consequence was the unbroken concentration, hour after hour, of exhausted men standing watch through the night, faithfully turning sandglasses and reading compass cards by lantern light, trusting a system built entirely on care, repetition, and hard-won experience. It is this fragile, cumulative knowledge that makes a changing wind so significant to an experienced officer. A shift in wind direction does not just threaten discomfort or danger from weather, it can also alter a ship's actual course without anyone immediately realizing it, introducing a small, compounding error into the dead reckoning that, if not caught and corrected, could leave the ship considerably off its intended track by the time land was finally expected to appear. The officer of the watch, having ordered that slight reduction in sail, now also adjusts the ship's heading by a few careful degrees, compensating for the new wind, and makes a quiet, deliberate note in the log slate he carries, a habit so deeply ingrained that he does it almost without conscious thought, the way a person checks that a door is locked before bed, an act of discipline performed less because today demands it than because every night might. Below him, in the captain's cabin, the man himself has not yet fully surrendered to sleep. He lies in his narrow berth, fully dressed but for his coat and boots, a habit he has kept since his earliest years at sea. The simple, practical readiness of a man who has learned, through hard experience, exactly how quickly a calm night can turn into something else entirely, and exactly how much time is lost, in those critical first moments of a crisis, by a man who has to dress before he can act. It is somewhere in the deep, undifferentiated hours that follow, the time sailors of the era sometimes called the graveyard hours, the stretch between midnight and the first hint of dawn when the body's own rhythms fight hardest against wakefulness, that the wind finally announces unmistakably that the change the officer of the watch sensed earlier was no passing fancy. It builds steadily now, no longer a subtle freshening but a real, gathering force, driving the ship harder through swells that have grown noticeably larger over the past several hours, each one lifting the stern and sending a long, rolling shudder through the entire hull before passing beneath the bow. For the wife lying awake beside her sleeping children in the hold, this change registers first not as sound but as motion. A deepening, more violent roll that sends loose items sliding across the deck somewhere nearby with a scraping clatter that makes her flinch in the dark. She has felt rough weather before on this voyage, 2 or 3 nights in the past 5 weeks when the sea grew unkind enough to keep most of the passengers awake and miserable. But something in the particular rhythm of tonight's motion feels different to her, though she could not say precisely how, beyond the simple, animal certainty that her body recognizes danger before her mind has fully articulated it. She reaches out instinctively and draws her younger child a few inches closer, tucking the blanket more securely around them both. A gesture that does nothing to change the ship's situation but everything to steady her own racing heart. It is in hours like these, awake, frightened, with nothing to do but wait and listen, that the mind of nearly everyone aboard, passenger and sailor alike, tends to wander toward the darker corners of imagination and memory that daylight and activity normally keep at bay. For sailors of this era, the ocean at night was understood through a rich, well-documented body of superstition that existed alongside, and sometimes in genuine tension with, the practical, technical knowledge that actually kept ships safe. Whistling on deck, many sailors believed, could summon a wind that the ship did not want. A superstition with enough hold on the maritime imagination that the act of deliberately whistling for wind during a true calm was its own separate, sanctioned practice, distinct from the careless whistling that might call up a storm. Certain words, drowning in particular, were considered unlucky to speak aloud at sea, replaced by euphemism among superstitious crews. And a phenomenon that genuinely did occur, and that genuinely did unsettle sailors who witnessed it without fully understanding its cause, was the eerie blue-white glow known as St. Elmo's fire, a real, documented atmospheric electrical phenomenon that occasionally appeared, particularly during stormy conditions, dancing along the tips of masts and yardarms with a soft, ghostly light. Sailors of this era, lacking the scientific understanding of atmospheric electricity that would later explain the phenomenon, often interpreted it as a supernatural omen, sometimes a protective sign, sometimes a warning, and its appearance on the nights it occurred was the kind of thing remembered and retold for years afterward in forecastles and dockside taverns alike. Death itself, when it came at sea, carried its own grave, particular rituals, ones that every experienced sailor knew, and that hung, unspoken, at the edge of every passenger's awareness as a possibility they tried not to dwell on too directly. A sailor or passenger who died during the voyage was, in the absence of any possibility of bringing the body home, prepared for burial at sea. Sewn into his own hammock or a length of canvas, weighted with stones, cannonballs, or whatever heavy ballast could be spared, and, according to a grim, practical tradition recorded across multiple maritime accounts of the era, the final stitch of the canvas shroud was sometimes passed through the nose of the deceased. A last, certain check, born of genuine historical fear of being buried, or in this case committed to the sea while still alive. The captain, or in the absence of a chaplain the ship's senior officer, would read a brief service, often drawn from the Book of Common Prayer, before the body was tipped from a plank into the water, to sink quickly beneath the weight of its ballast and disappear, with no grave, no marker, nothing left behind but a name entered into the ship's log and the memory of those who had sailed beside the departed. It is a measure of how present this possibility remained, even on an ordinary voyage with no illness or accident yet to speak of, that the wife in the hold finds her mind returning to it now, unbidden, as the ship rolls and groans around her in the dark. Not because death feels imminent tonight, exactly, but because the particular vulnerability of this moment, awake in the blackness with her children beside her and an ocean she cannot see or control beneath her, makes every fear she has been quietly carrying since departure day feel suddenly, uncomfortably close to the surface. She finds herself praying silently, the way she has most nights of this voyage, not for anything specific beyond the simple, fierce wish that grips every frightened parent in the dark, that morning will come, and that everyone she loves will still be there to see it. Above her, on deck, the wind continues to build. The boatswain's call comes sometime in the deepest part of the night, sharp and urgent in a way that every sailor aboard recognizes instantly, even pulled from the heaviest sleep. Not the routine summons of a watch change, but the unmistakable signal for all hands. Within seconds, the forecastle is a scramble of motion. Men rolling from hammocks already half-dressed, pulling on boots and oilskins by feel in the dark, No one wasting breath on questions because the call itself has already answered the only question that matters. Something has changed, and the ship needs every able body it has. On deck, the scene that greets them confirms what the wind had been promising for hours. The swells have grown into real waves now, their crests catching what little ambient light exists and breaking white against the dark. The ship pitching and rolling through them with a violence that makes simply standing upright a matter of conscious effort and practiced balance. Spray comes over the bow in sheets, stinging cold against exposed skin, and the wind itself has risen to a steady, driving force that makes the rigging sing with a higher, harder note than the gentle moan of earlier in the evening. What sailors of the era, with characteristic understatement, would simply call a fresh gale, a category of weather serious enough to demand real, immediate action, though still well short of the truly catastrophic storms that occasionally claimed ships outright. The captain is on deck now, fully dressed, his earlier instinct to sleep in readiness having paid for itself in the minutes saved. His orders come fast and clear, cutting through the wind with the particular carrying quality that comes from decades of practice making oneself heard over a gale. Reef the topsails, reduce the ship's exposed canvas before the wind can do it for them in a far less controlled fashion, tearing sail to ribbons or worse, snapping a mast under sudden, uneven strain. Men swarm up the rigging into the dark, climbing rope ladders that pitch and swing with the ship's motion, working by feel as much as sight to gather in and tie off great sheets of canvas now heavy and stiff with spray. A task that under any other circumstances would seem like a reasonable definition of madness, and that these men perform as a matter of routine, trained reflex, their hands finding familiar knots and lines without needing to think through each individual motion. This is, perhaps, the single most dangerous task that an ordinary sailor performed in the entire course of an Atlantic voyage, working aloft, in the dark, in a rising gale, on a footrope that offers the only purchase between a sailor's boots and a fall that, on a pitching ship in heavy seas, was very often fatal. Maritime records and ship's logs of this era confirm, soberly and repeatedly, that falls from the rigging represented one of the most common causes of death and serious injury among merchant sailors, a risk so ordinary, so built into the basic fabric of the job, that crews simply accepted it as one of the costs of the trade, mourned briefly when it happened, and returned to work because the ship, and everyone still aboard her, required nothing less. Below decks, the passengers experienced this same gale not as a series of clear, comprehensible tasks but as pure, disorienting chaos. The ship's motion grown violent enough now that anyone not braced against something solid risks being thrown bodily across the cramped space, loose belongings sliding and crashing in the dark, the children waking now, frightened and crying, while their mother does the only thing she can do, which is hold them close, brace her back against the hull and wait. Somewhere nearby, she can hear another passenger being violently, helplessly seasick again, the motion overwhelming even a body that had adjusted, weeks ago, to ordinary conditions. The young man traveling alone on his indenture contract sits gripping a support beam with both hands, his earlier anxieties about the unknown future awaiting him in the colonies entirely displaced. For now, by the much more immediate, much more total fear of simply surviving the next several hours. And then, from somewhere above, comes a sound that cuts through even the roar of the gale. A sharp, violent crack, followed immediately by shouting on deck, voices raised in the particular, controlled urgency of men responding to a genuine emergency rather than routine danger. In the hold, every passenger who hears it goes still, straining to understand, with no way of knowing, and no way for several long, terrible minutes of finding out exactly what has just gone wrong above their heads and exactly what it might mean for all of them. The sound, it turns out, is the topsail yard, the heavy wooden spar from which the topsail itself hangs, cracking under the combined strain of wind and the ship's violent motion, a failure serious enough to demand immediate attention but not, as the worst version of this sound might have signaled, the catastrophic loss of a mast itself, an event that could cripple a ship entirely and leave her at the mercy of the storm with no real means of control. The captain's voice rises again above the wind, directing men to cut away the damaged section before its weight and uncontrolled swinging could do further harm, perhaps injuring a man working nearby or fouling other rigging the ship still desperately needs. It is in moments like this that the accumulated skill of an experienced crew becomes, quite literally, the difference between a frightening but survivable night and a genuine disaster. Men who have spent years learning every line and spar of a ship exactly like this one move with a speed and coordination that would be impossible for anyone less practiced, cutting the damaged yard free, securing the loose canvas before it can be torn away entirely and lost over the side, working in near-total darkness, soaked through, cold to the bone, hands numbed by spray and wind, relying on muscle memory built through years of exactly this kind of work. One young sailor, working high in the rigging to secure a loose line, loses his footing for one heart-stopping instant as the ship rolls hard beneath him. A moment that, on a different night, with a fraction less luck or a fraction less quick a grip, might have ended very differently, but catches himself on the footrope, hangs for a moment with his heart pounding harder than the gale around him, and then, because there is no time to do anything else, continues the work. Below, the carpenter and several hands have gone to check the pumps, a routine but essential precaution during any heavy weather, since a ship working hard against large waves inevitably takes on some water through the hull seams, water that collects in the bilge and must be pumped out regularly to prevent it from accumulating to dangerous levels. Tonight, the amount they find is more than usual but not alarming, the ordinary cost of riding out an ordinary gale, not the urgent, rising flood that would signal a genuine breach in the hull. They man the pumps anyway, the steady, rhythmic clank and gush of bilge water being forced up and over the side becoming one more sound layered into the storm's chorus. One more task performed not because tonight demands anything extraordinary, but because the routine, faithful performance of exactly these unglamorous tasks is what has kept this ship, and ships like her, afloat across thousands of similar nights for as long as merchant vessels have crossed this ocean. In the hold, the long minutes of not knowing finally end when one of the ship's boys, sent below by the captain with brief, deliberately calm instructions, descends partway down the companionway and calls out over the gale that the ship has lost a yard but is sound, that the captain says to hold fast and stay below, that there is no cause for greater alarm than what they have already felt. It is not much information, and it does little to quiet the fear that has gripped the hold for the better part of an hour, but it is enough for the wife to finally let out a breath she seems to have been holding since the first crack of breaking wood, enough for her to gather her still frightened children a little closer and begin, in a low, unsteady voice, to hum the first few bars of a song from home, less because she believes it will calm them than because she needs, herself, the simple physical act of doing something other than waiting. The worst of the gale holds for perhaps 2 more hours. 2 hours that feel, to nearly everyone aboard, considerably longer, stretched thin by exhaustion, cold, and the particular grinding strain of sustained fear, before the wind finally, gradually, begins to ease. The change comes slowly enough that no one trusts it at first, the captain and his officers continuing to watch the sky and the sea with the same wary attention they have held all night, unwilling to relax their guard prematurely, having seen, in other storms on other voyages, false lulls that gave way to renewed and even worse weather. But this time the easing holds. The wind backs slowly toward its earlier, gentler direction. The waves, still large, lose some of their violent, breaking energy, settling into a long, rolling swell that the ship rides with far less drama than the chaos of the preceding hours. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the sky begins to change. Dawn at sea, after a night like this one, arrives with a particular, almost sacred quality that few people who have not lived through such a night can fully understand. It begins as the faintest possible lightning at the eastern edge of the world. Not color yet, not even truly light, but a subtle, almost imagined difference between the black of the sky and the black of the sea that experienced eyes catch before anyone could properly say what they were looking at. Slowly, over perhaps half an hour, that difference deepens into a low band of deep gray, then a bruised purple, then, finally, the first genuine color of the day. A thin line of pale gold spreading along the horizon, igniting the undersides of the storm's retreating clouds in shades of rose and amber that stand in almost unbearable contrast to the violence of the night just past. On deck, the men of the morning watch, hollow-eyed and soaked through, salt-crusted and bone-tired in a way that goes beyond ordinary fatigue, watch this sunrise with an attention that has nothing to do with its beauty, though its beauty is real and considerable, and everything to do with what it represents. Another night survived, another small victory in the long, unglamorous war that every Atlantic crossing represented against an ocean that owed these people nothing and gave nothing freely. The captain, finally allowing himself to stand still for the first time in hours, looks out at the lightning horizon and does the only thing left to do, which is the same thing he has done every morning of this voyage and every morning of decades of voyages before it. He takes his bearings as best the morning light allows, makes his notes, and begins, once again, the patient work of figuring out exactly where this long night's wind and water have actually carried his ship. Below decks, word of the dawn passes through the hold in the particular, informal way that news travels on a ship. A sailor calling down through the hatch, a passenger venturing partway up the companionway to see for themselves and returning with the report. The wife, who has not truly slept, who has spent the last several hours simply holding her children and listening to the gradual, blessed quieting of the wind, allows herself, finally, to believe that the worst of the night has genuinely passed. She loosens her grip on her younger child, who has fallen back into an exhausted sleep despite everything, and looks across the dim space to where her husband sits, equally hollow-eyed, equally undone by a night neither of them will ever fully describe to anyone who was not there to live it. They do not speak. There is, in this moment, nothing that needs to be said that the simple act of having survived together does not already say more completely than words could manage. On deck, as the light strengthens, the full scope of the night's damage becomes visible for the first time. The splintered stub of the broken yard, already being assessed by the carpenter for repair. Coils of rigging that need resetting. A deck still slick with spray and seawater that will need clearing before the day's ordinary work can resume. It is, by any honest measure, a significant amount of damage and a genuinely dangerous night, but it is not, and this distinction matters enormously, a catastrophe. No one has been lost. The hull is sound. The cargo, though shifted and in places damaged by the violent motion, remains largely intact. By the unforgiving arithmetic of an 18th century Atlantic crossing, this counts, unambiguously, as a good outcome. A hard, frightening, costly night, but a survived one, and survival on this ocean in this century was never a guarantee extended to anyone. The young man traveling on his indenture contract emerges on deck sometime mid-morning, drawn up by the simple, animal need for air after a night spent gripping a beam below decks in terror, and finds himself standing at the rail watching the ocean in the daylight for what feels, despite 5 weeks at sea, like the first time he has truly seen it. It is calmer now, vast and gray-blue and rolling gently beneath a sky scrubbed clean by the departed storm, giving no outward sign of the violence it had contained just hours before. He thinks, standing there, of the fear that had gripped him in the dark. Fear of the storm, but also, underneath it, fear of everything still waiting for him on the other side of this water. A future he could not see and could not control any more than he had been able to control the wind. And he finds, somewhat to his own surprise, that having survived the night, that future no longer feels quite so unbearably uncertain. If he could endure this, he thinks he can probably endure what comes after it too. This, perhaps, is the quiet, unspoken truth that ran underneath every Atlantic crossing of this era, felt by sailors and passengers alike, whether or not any of them would have put it into exactly these words. That the voyage itself, with its accumulated nights of fear and discomfort and uncertainty, was already a kind of preparation. A test that, once passed, left a person changed, sturdier, more capable of facing whatever waited for them on the far side of the water, because they had already proven, to themselves if no one else, that they could survive the ocean's worst and still rise, the next morning, to face the next day. But the storm that nearly claimed a yard and kept 30-odd people awake through the deepest hours of one particular night was only one kind of danger this ocean held, and in some ways not even the kind that sailors of this era feared most. There was another danger, quieter and slower, that haunted Atlantic crossings just as persistently as any gale, and it is worth pausing here, in the relative calm of this dawn, to understand it, because it shaped the rhythm of fear aboard a vessel like this one just as profoundly as the storm we have just lived through. That danger was the absence of wind altogether, the condition sailors called being becalmed, when the air itself simply stopped moving, leaving a ship's sails hanging slack and useless against the masts, the vessel drifting, essentially motionless, on a sea gone flat and glassy under an indifferent sun. To a modern audience, accustomed to thinking of storms as the central danger of historical sea travel, a calm might sound almost peaceful by comparison, but to the people aboard an 18th century merchant ship, a prolonged calm carried its own particular, creeping terror, one rooted not in sudden violence but in slow, grinding arithmetic. Every day a ship sat becalmed was a day closer to exhausting its fixed, finite stores of food and water, with no way to hasten the wind's return and no way to know how many more such days might lie ahead. Ship's logs and sailors' accounts from this era record calms lasting not hours but days, occasionally more than a week, during which a vessel might drift only a handful of miles despite the ceaseless effort of her crew. The heat building below decks with no breeze to relieve it, tempers fraying among passengers and crew alike, and the captain forced into the grim daily exercise of recalculating exactly how much longer the ship's remaining provisions could be stretched if the wind did not return soon. It was during calms, too, that the threat of disease found its most fertile ground. The stagnant air below decks, already thick with the accumulated odors of weeks at sea, grew worse without the ship's motion to encourage some natural circulation through hatches and gratings, and the close, unwashed confinement of dozens of bodies in poor ventilation created ideal conditions for the spread of illness. Typhus in particular, a disease then commonly called ship fever or jail fever, spread by body lice that thrived in exactly these crowded, unsanitary conditions and capable of moving through a ship's company with frightening speed once it took hold. A serious outbreak of fever aboard a vessel already weeks from land, with no real medical resources beyond whatever the ship's surgeon, if one was even carried, could provide, represented one of the genuine catastrophic risks of any long Atlantic crossing, arguably a more statistically significant danger, across the full population of people who made this journey in the 18th century, than the storms that loom larger in popular imagination of the era. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reshapes, somewhat, the picture of danger we have been building throughout this story. The storm our ship survived tonight was real, frightening, and genuinely dangerous, but it was also, in its way, the kind of danger this ship and her crew were built and trained to handle, a known quantity that skill, experience, and a sound vessel could generally overcome. The slower dangers, disease, starvation during a prolonged calm, the simple compounding risk of weeks upon weeks of confinement, poor diet, and physical strain wearing down even healthy bodies, were, in their own way, more insidious, because they offered no single dramatic moment to rise to, no clear crisis to meet with trained, decisive action. They simply accumulated, day by day, until they became a crisis almost without anyone aboard quite marking the moment it began. It is worth asking, too, how the men who fought this ship through the night's gale came to be standing in her rigging in the first place, because the answer reveals another layer of the era's hard, often unforgiving realities. Some sailors aboard a typical merchant vessel had chosen this life freely, drawn to the sea by family tradition, by the absence of better prospects ashore, or, in some cases, by a genuine love of the work and the particular, hard-won freedom that came with a trade few landsmen could master. Merchant crews, unlike naval crews, were generally manned through voluntary enlistment, sailors signing articles for a specific voyage in exchange for agreed wages, a system that gave merchant sailors somewhat more control over their circumstances than their naval counterparts. That distinction mattered enormously because the Royal Navy of this era relied heavily on a far more coercive practice. Impressment, commonly known as press-ganging, in which naval officers and the armed parties under their command were legally empowered, particularly during wartime, to forcibly seize merchant sailors, and sometimes other men with little or no maritime experience at all, directly off the streets of port towns, or even from the decks of merchant ships themselves, compelling them into naval service whether they wished to go or not. This created a persistent, genuine anxiety among merchant sailors of the era, particularly when a voyage's timing coincided with one of the many wars Britain fought during the 18th century, since a sailor who had signed articles for a peaceful merchant voyage might find himself, upon returning to port, seized by a press gang and sent instead into the considerably more dangerous and far less well-compensated service of a warship, with little legal recourse and even less practical hope of appeal. For the crew of our ship, sailing as they are on an ordinary merchant voyage rather than a naval one, this particular fear belongs more to homecoming than to the crossing itself, a worry that lives at the edge of awareness for men whose actual, immediate danger tonight has been the gale itself, not the press gangs of Bristol or Liverpool. But it is a reminder, nonetheless, of how little true autonomy many of these men possessed over the shape of their own working lives, caught between the genuine, hard-won skill and pride of their trade and a maritime labor system that could, at any moment, override their own choices entirely. The able seaman who caught himself on the footrope tonight, hanging for one heart-stopping moment above a churning sea, had chosen this voyage of his own free will, but he had also lived, in years past, with the constant low hum of anxiety that comes from knowing that choice could be taken from him at any time, by men with more legal authority than he possessed and no particular interest in his own preferences. Aboard a merchant ship of this period, authority below the captain rested on a structure that, while less brutal in its formal punishments than naval discipline often was, still demanded real, consistent order among dozens of people confined together under genuinely stressful conditions for weeks on end. The captain held legal authority to enforce discipline, and while merchant captains generally relied more on the practical, social pressures of shipboard life reputation, the threat of reduced wages or unfavorable reports to future employers, the simple physical reality that a crew of this size needed to function as a cooperative unit to survive at all, physical punishment for serious infractions, including flogging, remained within a captain's legal authority and was, on occasion, employed, particularly in cases of theft, serious insubordination, or behavior that endangered the ship. Most experienced captains understood, however, that a crew pushed too hard through excessive harshness made for a resentful, unreliable ship's company in exactly the moments. A storm, an emergency, a long and grueling stretch of bad weather, when unity and trust mattered most, and the better captains of this era, the ones whose ships earned reputations as good vessels to sail on, generally governed through a careful, practical balance of firm authority and earned respect rather than through fear alone. If illness or injury struck during a voyage like this one, the resources available to treat it depended enormously on the size and wealth of the vessel. Larger merchant ships, particularly those engaged in longer or more lucrative trade routes, sometimes carried a trained surgeon, a position distinct from a physician in the medical hierarchy of the era. Surgeons of this period were trained primarily in practical, hands-on treatment, setting broken bones, treating wounds, performing amputations when necessary, and managing the common ailments of shipboard life, rather than in the more theoretical, university-trained tradition of physicians, who rarely went to sea at all. Smaller merchant vessels, including many ordinary trading ships of the kind carrying our particular cast of characters, often carried no formally trained medical practitioner whatsoever, leaving the captain or an experienced senior officer to manage illness and injury as best they could, drawing on a combination of accumulated practical experience and whatever basic medical guides or remedies the ship happened to carry. The medicine of this era, even in its most skilled and well-resourced form, operated under a fundamentally different understanding of the human body and disease than anything a modern audience would recognize. Germ theory, which would eventually explain how diseases like typhus actually spread, lay more than a century in the future. Many physicians and surgeons of the 18th century still operated, to varying degrees, within older frameworks of medical thought, including the ancient theory of bodily humors, which held that health depended on a proper balance of 4 fluids within the body, and that illness resulted from an imbalance correctable through treatments such as bloodletting, the deliberate withdrawal of blood from a patient, a practice that, however counterproductive it appears by modern medical understanding, was considered a legitimate and often first-line treatment for a wide range of ailments throughout this period. A ship's surgeon, faced with a feverish patient, might well treat that fever with bloodletting, or with emetics designed to induce vomiting, treatments that reflected the genuine, good-faith medical understanding of the era even though they offered little real benefit and, in some cases, actively worsened a patient's condition. What did help, even without a full scientific understanding of why, was basic, practical wound care, cleaning injuries, splinting and setting broken bones, the kind of hands-on, mechanically sound treatment that did not depend on understanding germ theory to be effective. The able seaman who had injured his fingers in years past, the kind of old, half-healed wounds we imagined him carrying earlier in this story, would likely have received exactly this sort of practical care at the time of his original injury. Cleaning, splinting, and time, with the body's own considerable capacity for healing doing most of the actual work, assisted rather than replaced by the surgeon's intervention. It is against this medical backdrop that the symptoms of scurvy we discussed earlier carried such particular dread among experienced sailors, because scurvy was a disease that practical, mechanically sound treatment could not touch. No amount of wound cleaning or careful splinting addressed a deficiency the era did not yet fully understand, even with Lynn's experiments demonstrating citrus as an effective treatment circulating, slowly and unevenly, through the maritime world. A sailor or passenger who developed serious scurvy symptoms on a voyage like this one, weeks from land and with no fresh fruit remaining aboard, faced a condition that the ship's accumulated medical knowledge, however well-intentioned, simply could not reliably cure. One more example of how thin and fragile the margin of safety truly was for anyone making this crossing, no matter how skilled the crew or how sound the ship. And yet, for all of this, the danger, the deprivation, the genuine uncertainty that shadowed every day of the voyage. Life aboard a ship like this one was not lived in constant, unrelieved dread. Human beings, placed in even the most difficult and confined circumstances, find ways to create small pockets of normalcy, community, and even genuine joy, and the Atlantic crossing of the 18th century was no exception to this deeply human pattern. Sundays, observed by most ships of this era regardless of the particular religious denomination of the captain or crew, typically brought a brief suspension of ordinary work in favor of a simple religious service, often led by the captain himself in the absence of an ordained chaplain, reading prayers from the Book of Common Prayer or an equivalent text to whatever portion of the ship's company could be gathered on deck. For passengers in particular, this weekly ritual offered a rare, structured break from the otherwise undifferentiated grind of shipboard time, a moment that connected the strange, suspended reality of the voyage back to the familiar rhythms of life ashore. Music, too, played a significant and well-documented role in shipboard life, particularly among the crew. Sailors of this era sang work songs, shanties in later terminology, though the exact vocabulary varied across different periods and traditions, that served a genuinely practical function, their rhythm helping coordinate the timing of physically demanding, repetitive tasks like hauling on a line or working a capstan, while also providing a welcome outlet for the tedium and physical strain of the work itself. In quieter hours, off watch, sailors with any musical skill might play a fiddle or simple wind instrument if one had been brought aboard, while others told stories. Tall tales of previous voyages, ghost stories of the kind that found such fertile ground in the genuine uncertainty and isolation of an ocean crossing, and the kind of crude, good-natured humor that helped men confined together for weeks maintain something resembling morale and camaraderie despite the genuine hardship of their circumstances. For passengers, similar small comforts emerged where they could. Families shared what modest provisions, stories, and company they had brought aboard. Children, with the particular resilience and adaptability of youth, often found ways to play even in the cramped confines of the hold, inventing games from whatever materials were available, their laughter occasionally drifting up through the hatches to reach crew members on deck above, a small, incongruous reminder, in the midst of an often grim and dangerous undertaking, of the ordinary human life that continued, in whatever form it could, even here, in the middle of an ocean that offered no guarantees to anyone aboard. It is worth pausing here, in this in-between hour of recovery and reflection, to place this single ship and this single night within the much larger picture of the Atlantic world that produced it, because the ocean our characters have just survived was, in the 18th century, host to an extraordinary diversity of human experience, not all of it comparable, and not all of it nearly so survivable as the voyage we have been following. The merchant vessel at the center of this story, carrying manufactured goods, a handful of paying passengers, and indentured servants bound for several years of contracted labor, represented one particular and relatively common category of Atlantic crossing in this era. But it existed alongside other kinds of vessels making other kinds of voyages across the same ocean, under dramatically different and, in some cases, far more horrific conditions. Ships engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, carrying enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage to forced labor in the Americas, operated under a system of organized brutality that bears no genuine comparison to the hardships, real as they were, faced by the free and indentured passengers of an ordinary merchant voyage like the one we have spent this night aboard. Mortality rates on slave ships, driven by deliberate overcrowding, inadequate food and water, and conditions designed to maximize profit at catastrophic human cost, vastly exceeded those of ordinary passenger and trade voyages, and the suffering inflicted aboard those vessels was the product of calculated, systemic cruelty rather than simply the accumulated, unavoidable hardship of ocean travel itself. It is important, in telling an honest story about the 18th century Atlantic, not to flatten these distinct experiences into a single undifferentiated narrative of hardship at sea, because doing so would obscure one of the central moral facts of this era, that the same ocean carried both the hopeful, hard-pressed emigrant family in our story's hold and, on other ships, on other nights, people stripped of their freedom entirely and subjected to a system of violence that the merchant trade, whatever its genuine dangers, did not inflict upon those who sailed it by choice or contract. Within the world of ordinary merchant shipping itself, conditions and dangers also varied considerably depending on the particular trade route, the wealth and care of the ship's owners, and significantly on whether Britain happened to be at war during a given voyage, and across the middle decades of the 18th century, Britain was, more often than not, at war with one or more of its European rivals, a condition that added an entirely additional layer of danger to ordinary commercial shipping. During wartime, merchant vessels became legitimate targets for enemy privateers, privately owned and armed ships, operating under government license, authorized to capture or destroy enemy merchant shipping in exchange for a share of the captured cargo's value. A merchant ship sailing during one of these periods of conflict faced the genuine possibility of encountering an armed privateer somewhere on the open ocean, an encounter that could end in the loss of the entire ship and cargo, the imprisonment of the crew, and considerable danger to any passengers aboard, even though outright violence toward captured civilian crews was, by the conventions of the era, somewhat less common than popular imagination of piracy often suggests, since a captured ship and crew typically represented more value intact, as a prize to be sold or ransomed, than destroyed outright. Piracy in the more classic, popularly imagined sense, independent outlaws operating entirely outside any government sanction, the era of figures whose names remain famous centuries later, had, by the mid-18th century, declined substantially from its peak in earlier decades, suppressed by increasingly determined naval action and improved organization among the major trading nations. It had not vanished entirely, particularly in certain waters such as the Caribbean and along less heavily patrolled stretches of coastline, but for a vessel making a fairly direct crossing of the open Atlantic, of the kind our ship is undertaking, the more pressing and statistically significant dangers remained the ones we have already explored at length. Storm, disease, navigational error, and the simple, grinding accumulation of risk that came with spending 2 months at the mercy of wind and water, rather than the cinematic threat of a pirate attack that looms so much larger in popular imagination than it did in the actual lived statistics of ordinary 18th century merchant shipping. Taken together, these realities paint a picture of an Atlantic crossing as a genuinely dangerous undertaking, but one whose dangers were various, layered, and unevenly distributed depending on who exactly was making the journey, aboard what kind of vessel, under what conditions. Our family in the hold, our able seamen in the rigging, our captain pacing the quarterdeck through the long hours of the gale. All of them faced real risk tonight, risk that was neither exaggerated nor invented for dramatic effect, but risk that existed within a recognizable, survivable range for an ordinary merchant voyage of this era, the kind of risk that thousands of people accepted, more or less knowingly, every single year, in pursuit of trade, opportunity, and the simple, stubborn human hope for a better life on the other side of the water. As the morning advances and the ship's company settles into the considerable work of recovering from the night's gale, it is worth turning our attention, briefly, to the youngest member of this small floating community, the ship's boy we glimpsed earlier, sleeping soundly through the first hours of rising wind before the storm itself made sleep impossible for anyone aboard, because his experience of this voyage, and of this life, differed in important ways from every other person we have followed tonight, and because the path that brought a child of 10 or 11 years old into a working role aboard an ocean-going vessel reveals something important about how this entire maritime world reproduced and sustained itself across generations. Boys entered the seafaring trade through several common paths in this era. Some were the sons of sailors themselves, raised in port towns where the sea represented not an exotic adventure but the entirely ordinary, expected family trade, much as a blacksmith's son might be expected to eventually take up his father's hammer and forge. Others were formally apprenticed by parents or guardians to a ship's captain or owner, a legal arrangement not unlike the indenture contracts that bound some of the adult passengers below decks, committing the boy to a period of years learning the trade in exchange for his labor, with the promise, if he survived and proved capable, of eventually working his way up through the ranks we discussed earlier, ordinary seamen, able seamen, and, for the most capable and fortunate, eventually mate and, possibly captain himself. Still others, particularly orphans or boys from very poor families with few other prospects, were sent to sea through parish or charitable arrangements, the maritime trade serving, in this sense, as one of the 18th century's rough, imperfect mechanisms for providing some path forward to children whom land-based society had little other use or care for. Whatever path brought him aboard, a ship's boy's daily existence was one of near-constant labor, performed under the watchful, often harsh supervision of the older sailors above him in the ship's hierarchy. He fetched food and water for the crew, ran messages between officers and men, assisted in the endless work of maintaining rigging and rope, and performed whatever unpleasant, menial tasks the adult sailors preferred not to do themselves. Emptying waste, scrubbing the deck, assisting the cook in the cramped, smoky galley where the ship's meals were prepared over a carefully tended fire, itself a significant fire risk aboard a wooden vessel that demanded constant, careful attention. He slept in whatever corner of the forecastle the older men did not claim, ate after the able seamen had taken their portions, and absorbed, alongside the practical skills of his trade, the rough culture and discipline of shipboard life through near-constant correction, instruction, and not infrequently physical chastisement from the men responsible for training him. And yet, for all its hardship, this apprenticeship represented, for many boys of this era, a genuine path toward skill, respect, and eventual independence that few other available trades could match. A boy who survived his early years at sea, who absorbed the accumulated practical knowledge of navigation, seamanship, and ship handling that surrounded him daily, who proved himself reliable and capable in exactly the kind of crisis our ship weathered tonight, stood a real chance, over years of accumulated service, of rising through the ranks to a position of genuine authority and respect. Captain of his own vessel, perhaps, eventually, commanding the same kind of unquestioning trust and obedience from his own crew that our captain commands tonight, built from decades of exactly this kind of hard, patient accumulation of skill and proven judgment. It is a sobering thought, watching this particular boy sleep through the first hours of a gale that would test even experienced grown men, to realize that he is, in a very real sense, already living the first chapter of exactly the kind of life story that produced the calm, decisive captain currently directing the ship's recovery on deck above him, that the chain connecting a frightened, exhausted 11-year-old to a seasoned master mariner was not a metaphor but a literal, well-worn path, that thousands of boys exactly like him walked across the 18th century, one voyage, one storm, one slowly accumulated skill at a time. By mid-morning, with the worst of the storm's damage assessed and initial repairs underway, the ship settles into a new, temporary rhythm, not the routine watch and rest cycle of an ordinary day at sea, but the focused, all-hands effort of recovery. The carpenter and his assistants work to fashion a temporary repair for the broken yard, using timber and tools carried aboard for exactly this kind of contingency, since a ship that could not repair its own damage somewhere in the middle of an ocean, far from any port or shipyard, would face a far more serious crisis than the temporary inconvenience of reduced sail. Other hands work to reset rigging, secure cargo that had shifted during the night's violent motion, and restore the ship to something resembling her ordinary working order. The passengers, for their part, slowly emerge from the hold over the course of the morning, drawn up by air, light, and the simple human need to see open sky after a night of confined, frightened darkness, gathering in small groups on deck to exchange quiet accounts of how each of them had experienced the night, the particular communal relief of survivors comparing notes settling gradually over the ship's company like a kind of collective exhale. The days that follow the storm settle back into the familiar, grinding rhythm of an ordinary Atlantic crossing, watches standing and relieving each other around the clock, meals of biscuit and salt meat eaten at their accustomed hours. The slow, careful work of dead reckoning continuing day after day as the captain and his officers track the ship's progress across charts that record an estimated position rather than a certain one. 3 more weeks pass in this fashion, weeks that contain their own smaller dramas. A brief illness that passes through several passengers without developing into anything more serious. A near collision avoided in heavy fog with another vessel making the opposite crossing, glimpsed and lost again within minutes, close enough that her crew's shouted greetings carried faintly across the water before the fog swallowed her once more. But nothing that rises to the scale of the gale we have spent this night living through. It is in the final stretch of any Atlantic crossing, however, that a new kind of tension begins to replace the accumulated fatigue of the voyage's middle weeks. Not dread now, but a kind of taut, almost unbearable anticipation, as the ship draws near enough to her destination that everyone aboard begins watching, with renewed and obsessive attention, for the signs that experienced sailors knew to read as evidence that land, after 2 months of nothing but open water, might finally be near. The character of the water itself was often the first clue an experienced eye would notice. A subtle shift in color from the deep, clear blue of the open ocean toward the murkier, more greenish tone associated with shallower coastal waters, carrying suspended sediment washed down from rivers and coastlines that the ship had not yet seen but was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to approach. Floating vegetation, branches, leaves, sometimes entire uprooted trees carried out from coastal rivers, offered another welcome sign, as did a noticeable increase in the number and variety of birds visible from the deck, since most seabirds, contrary to a common misconception, rarely ventured truly far from land, and their presence in increasing numbers signaled, reliably, that the ship was drawing closer to a coastline somewhere beyond the visible horizon. As a ship approached water shallow enough to make grounding a genuine concern, her crew turned to one of the oldest and most reliable tools in the entire maritime tradition. The lead line, a length of rope marked at measured intervals and weighted with a lump of lead at one end, hollowed out and filled with tallow so that it would bring up a small sample of the seabed itself when it touched bottom. Sand, mud, gravel, or shell, each telling an experienced navigator something further about exactly where along a coastline the ship might be, since different stretches of seafloor carried distinctly different compositions that a knowledgeable captain, familiar with his intended destination, could often recognize and use to refine his estimated position. A sailor in the chains, a small platform projecting from the ship's side, would heave this lead forward, let it sink to the bottom as the ship's forward motion brought her over it, and call out the depth in a fathoms, a practice so essential to safe navigation in coastal waters that the rhythmic, repeated cry of the leadsman calling soundings became one of the defining sounds of a ship's final approach to land, a sound that, after 2 months of open ocean, every passenger and crew member alike learned to listen for with something approaching reverence. For the family in the hold, this final stretch of the voyage brought its own particular mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. The practical fears of the crossing itself, storm, illness, the slow erosion of food and water, gradually giving way to a different, more personal set of worries about what exactly awaited them on the other side. They knew, in broad outline, what they hoped to find. Land available for purchase or lease at prices unimaginable in the England they had left behind. A chance to build something of their own rather than scraping by as tenants on land they would never own. But hope and certainty are different things, and the wife found herself, in these final days, turning over the same questions that had occupied her husband privately for weeks. Whether the letters from relatives that had inspired this journey had described their new circumstances honestly or with the understandable, generous exaggeration of people eager to encourage family to join them, whether the land they had been promised access to would prove as fertile and available as described, whether the children, who had adapted so readily to the strange, confined world of the ship, would adapt as readily to whatever unfamiliar new world awaited them on the other side. For the young man bound by his indenture contract, the approach of land carried a different and more immediately consequential weight, because somewhere in the days following landfall, his contract would be sold, quite literally, as a legal and economic transaction, to whichever colonial buyer offered the ship's owners or agent the most favorable terms, and he would then owe several years of his labor to a master he had never met, under conditions he had no ability to negotiate or refuse. This system, formerly known as indentured servitude, represented one of the primary mechanisms by which the labor-hungry colonial economy of British North America met its needs throughout the 18th century, alongside the far more brutal and permanent institution of chattel slavery that we discussed earlier, a system that, while offering indentured servants the eventual prospect of freedom and, often, a small grant of land or goods at the conclusion of their term of service, nonetheless, bound them, for years at a time, into conditions that varied enormously depending entirely on the temperament and treatment of whatever master purchased their contract. A gamble the young man standing at the rail this morning had no way to handicap in advance, and no real choice but to accept. The moment of actual landfall, when it finally comes, arrives with a quality that surviving accounts from this era describe with a remarkable cross-generational consistency. A moment that, for all its practical navigational ordinariness to an experienced captain who has made this same crossing dozens of times before, carried an almost overwhelming emotional weight for passengers experiencing it for the first time. It begins, often, as nothing more than a faint, low smudge on the horizon, easily mistaken for a low bank of cloud by anyone not specifically watching for it, gradually resolving, over the course of an hour or more, into the unmistakable, solid outline of a coastline. Trees, in many cases, since much of the Atlantic seaboard of British North America in this era remained heavily forested, the deep green of an unfamiliar shore rising slowly out of the water as the ship continues her steady approach. Word spreads through the ship almost instantly once the first lookout's cry of land carries down from the masthead, and within minutes nearly every passenger and off-duty crew member has crowded to the rail, straining for their first sight, in 2 months, of anything solid that is not the deck of the ship itself. For the children in our family, too young to fully grasp the practical significance of the moment but old enough to absorb their parents' sudden, visible relief and excitement, this becomes a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind of communal celebration that breaks out spontaneously among strangers who have shared a genuinely difficult experience together and emerged, mostly whole, on the other side of it. For the adults, the joy carries a deeper, more complicated undertow. Relief at survival mixed inseparably with the dawning, immediate reality that the voyage's particular, bounded uncertainties are about to be replaced by an entirely new and in some ways more permanent set of uncertainties, the ones that come with actually beginning a new life in a place none of them have ever seen. The ship does not simply sail directly into her destination port upon sighting land. However, coastal waters demanded careful, often slow navigation, frequently requiring a local pilot, a mariner with detailed, specific knowledge of a particular harbor's currents, shoals, and channels, to come aboard and guide the vessel safely through waters too locally specific for even an experienced ocean navigator to manage with confidence. Depending on the port and the prevailing health regulations of the era, which varied considerably by colony and by period, the ship might also be required to undergo some form of inspection before passengers and crew were permitted ashore, a rudimentary but genuine early form of quarantine practice, reflecting the period's accumulated empirical understanding. Even without full scientific knowledge of disease transmission, that ships arriving from long voyages occasionally carried illness. That colonial authorities had real, practical reasons to want identified and contained before it could spread into a port town's population. Once finally cleared to land, the actual business of disembarkation began, and with it, the practical, unglamorous conclusion of the entire elaborate system of trade and migration that had brought every person aboard this ship across the ocean in the first place. Cargo was unloaded under the careful supervision of merchants and the ship's officers, manifests checked against actual goods landed, duties and fees calculated and paid according to the trade regulations of the colony in question. Passengers gathered their belongings, considerably lighter, in most cases, than what they had carried aboard 2 months earlier, their carefully rationed food stores long since exhausted, and made their way down the gangway onto solid ground for the first time since departure, their legs, adjusted over 2 months to the ship's constant motion, sometimes betraying them with an unsteady, swaying gait that took several days ashore to fully correct, a small but real physical reminder of just how completely their bodies had adapted to a world that no longer existed beneath their feet. For the young man with his indenture contract, landfall brought the beginning of the transaction that would determine the next several years of his life. The ship's agent or owner's representative would meet with prospective buyers, local farmers, craftsmen, and merchants seeking labor, to negotiate the sale of his contract and those of any other indentured passengers aboard, a process that, for the men and women whose futures were being decided, offered little real agency beyond hoping that whoever purchased their service proved reasonably fair in their treatment. Within days, possibly within hours, he would likely find himself departing the ship and the only community he had known for the past 2 months, bound for an unfamiliar farm or workshop, to begin a term of labor whose exact conditions remained, even now, largely beyond his control or knowledge. For the family, landfall meant the beginning of an entirely different kind of work. Locating the relatives whose encouraging letters had drawn them across the ocean, securing temporary lodging, and beginning the long, uncertain process of establishing themselves in a genuinely new world, one whose climate, soil, customs, and rhythms they would need to learn essentially from scratch, much as the ship's boy was still learning the trade that would, given enough time and survival, eventually make him a master mariner in his own right. And for the captain, and for the ship herself, landfall meant something different still. Not an ending, but simply the completion of one cycle within an ongoing, repeating pattern of work that would, after only a brief interval ashore to oversee unloading, take on new cargo, recruit or retain a crew, and depart once more, back across the same ocean, to begin the entire demanding, uncertain process again. It is worth stepping back, now, from the particular ship and the particular night we have spent these hours aboard, to consider the true scale of what we have been describing, because the voyage we have followed was never an isolated event. It was one small thread within an enormous, sustained pattern of human movement that reshaped the Atlantic world across the entire 18th century. Throughout this period, thousands of merchant voyages crossed the Atlantic in both directions every single year, carrying not only the manufactured goods and raw materials that formed the economic backbone of colonial trade, but hundreds of thousands of human beings. Emigrants seeking land and opportunity, indentured servants bound by contract, merchants and officials conducting the colonial administration's endless necessary business. And, on a smaller but still significant number of voyages, enslaved Africans transported under the entirely different and far more brutal conditions of the slave trade that we discussed earlier. This sustained, repeated movement of people across an ocean that offered no guarantees, using technology that, however refined by centuries of accumulated maritime experience, remained fundamentally at the mercy of wind, weather, and the limits of 18th-century navigation, represents one of the great underappreciated feats of ordinary human endurance in this era, not because any single voyage was extraordinary, but because of how thoroughly ordinary, how routinely repeated, the entire undertaking had become by the mid-18th century. The family in our stories hold, the young man with his indenture contract, the able seaman who caught himself on the footrope, the captain who has now safely brought his ship and her passengers through one more dangerous night. None of these people would have considered themselves remarkable. They were, in the most literal sense, ordinary people doing what tens of thousands of other ordinary people did across this same stretch of ocean, year after year, decade after decade, in pursuit of trade, opportunity, and the simple, durable human hope that crossing this particular body of water might lead to a better life than the one left behind. And yet it is precisely this ordinariness that makes their story worth telling with such care and attention, because history, as it is most commonly remembered and recounted, tends overwhelmingly to favor the exceptional. The famous voyages, the famous ships, the famous individuals whose names survived in the historical record precisely because something unusual happened to them, or because they happened to be wealthy, powerful, or literate enough to leave behind documents that historians, centuries later, could find and study. The vast majority of people who made this Atlantic crossing in the 18th century left no such record. We do not know their names. We do not know, in most cases, exactly what they thought or felt during the long nights of their own crossings, what fears kept them awake, what hopes sustained them through weeks of confinement, poor food, and genuine danger. What we know, instead, comes from the broader patterns recorded in ship's logs, port records, indenture contracts, surviving journals of the more literate minority, and the careful, patient work of historians piecing together, from these fragmentary sources, an honest picture of what this experience was generally like for the people who lived through it. This story, then, the family, the captain, the able seaman, the ship's boy, the young man bound by indenture, represents not a single documented historical event, but a faithful reconstruction, built from exactly this kind of accumulated historical evidence, of an experience that thousands of real, specific, individually named people actually lived through, even though the particular details of any single one of their nights have been lost to time in a way that this story's composite, carefully researched account cannot fully replace, but can, perhaps, honor, by taking seriously the genuine scale of fear, hardship, and quiet courage that an ordinary Atlantic crossing demanded of everyone who undertook it, and by refusing to flatten that experience into either uncomplicated adventure or uncomplicated misery, when the historical truth, as it so often is, was considerably more layered and human than either simple version would suggest. Let us return, one final time, to the ship herself, and to the people we have followed through this single long night, before we step back fully into our own century and consider what their experience might still mean to us. The captain, having seen his ship safely to harbor, would have turned almost immediately to the practical business of completing the voyage's formal obligations, reporting to the ship's owners or their colonial agents, accounting for the cargo delivered against what had been loaded weeks earlier in England, settling the wages owed to his crew, and beginning, often within days rather than weeks, the preparations for the return crossing, since a ship sitting idle in harbor earned her owners nothing, and the entire economic logic of merchant shipping depended on vessels spending as much of their working life as possible actually at sea, carrying cargo, rather than resting at anchor. For a man who had spent decades building exactly the kind of reputation and accumulated skill that brought a ship and her passengers safely through a gale like the one we have just lived through, this voyage would have represented simply one more entry in a long, ongoing career. Successful, certainly worth noting in his own private accounting of voyages completed and dangers survived, but not, in the larger arc of his working life, extraordinary. He would sail again. He would face other storms, other long nights, other moments when the accumulated skill of years stood between his ship's company and disaster. This was the shape of the life he had chosen decades earlier, when he himself had been a frightened ship's boy not unlike the one who slept through the first hours of tonight's gale. The able seaman, his wages settled, faced a choice common to sailors of his era. Sign on for the same ship's return voyage, securing continued employment with a captain and crew he had already proven himself alongside, or seek a berth on a different vessel, perhaps one offering better wages or a more appealing destination, accepting the small but real uncertainty of working among strangers in exchange for the possibility of better terms. Many sailors of this period moved between ships fairly fluidly across their careers, building reputations within the close, interconnected world of a major port's maritime community that followed them from vessel to vessel, the kind of reputation that mattered enormously in a trade where a captain's willingness to trust a man's competence in exactly the kind of crisis we have just witnessed could mean the difference between steady, reasonably well-paid employment and the much harder lot of sailors whose skill or reliability was, for whatever reason, in question. The ship's boy, having survived his first real Atlantic gale, would carry that experience forward as one more piece of the accumulated practical education that, over years of repeated voyages, would slowly transform him from a frightened child into a capable, experienced hand. The particular night we have followed, the boatswain's call cutting through his sleep, the chaos and danger of the storm, the slow, hard-won relief of dawn, would become, in time, simply one of many such nights, remembered perhaps in outline rather than in the vivid, overwhelming detail it carried for him as an 11-year-old experiencing real maritime danger for what may well have been the first time. As for the ship herself, the wooden hull that held all of these lives together through the long hours of this single night, her own eventual fate remains, in the way of most ordinary merchant vessels of this era, simply unrecorded by history. Unlike famous naval vessels or ships associated with significant historical events, the vast majority of 18th-century merchant ships left no lasting individual record of their ultimate end. Most served for years, sometimes decades, carrying cargo and passengers back and forth across the same demanding ocean, gradually wearing down under the relentless, cumulative strain of exactly the kind of weather we have witnessed tonight, until age, structural wear, or, in some cases, a storm considerably less survivable than this one finally brought their working lives to a close. Sold for scrap, lost at sea, or simply, eventually, retired from active service and left to decay in some harbor, their specific fate as unrecorded and unremembered as the names of most of the ordinary people who had once crossed an ocean within their hulls. There is something quietly significant in this anonymity, this absence of a clean, documented ending for either the ship or most of the people who sailed aboard her. It reflects, honestly, the true texture of most human history. Not a continuous sequence of dramatic, well-recorded events, but an overwhelming accumulation of ordinary lives, ordinary work, ordinary courage, lived and then simply ended, leaving behind little more than the broad, statistical traces from which historians can reconstruct a general, honest picture of what an experience like this one was actually like, even without being able to say with certainty exactly what happened to any single specific person who lived it. There is a particular soundscape that belongs entirely to a wooden ship at sea, one that, having spent this entire night exploring the human experience of an Atlantic crossing, is worth returning to one final time, slowly, and in full, because it was this soundscape, more than anything else, that filled the hours of darkness for everyone aboard, the constant unbroken auditory backdrop against which every fear, every hope, and every fragment of uneasy sleep took place. Beneath everything else, low and constant, sat the sound of water against the hull. Not a single sound but a whole layered family of them. The steady hiss and gurgle of the ship's wake trailing behind her stern, the deeper, percussive slap of larger waves striking the bow, the strange, almost musical gurgle of water moving through the bilge far below, audible in quiet moments to anyone lying still enough in their berth to notice it. Above this, the ship's timbers themselves contributed their own constant, low chorus. The long, deep groan of the hull working against the strain of wind and wave, individual creaks and pops as different joints and beams shifted fractionally against each other. A sound that newcomers to sea travel often found alarming, certain that the ship was on the verge of breaking apart beneath them, until experience taught them that this was simply the ordinary, expected voice of a wooden vessel doing exactly what a well-built wooden vessel was supposed to do, flexing and working with the sea rather than rigidly resisting it. Higher still, in the rigging, the wind found 1,000 different voices depending on its strength and the particular configuration of rope and canvas it passed through. A low, steady moan in moderate conditions, rising to the higher, harder note we heard during tonight's gale, punctuated by the sharp crack of canvas catching a gust at a new angle, the rhythmic creak of blocks and tackle as sails were trimmed and adjusted by the watch on duty. Footsteps overhead, audible to anyone below as a constant, ongoing percussion through the deck timbers, told their own story to an experienced ear. The steady pacing of an officer keeping watch, the sudden flurry of multiple footsteps that signaled some change in sail or course, the particular rhythm of men hauling together on a line, timed and coordinated by the work songs we discussed earlier. And beneath all of this, woven through every hour of every night of the voyage, came the ship's bell, struck every half hour around the clock, in a sequence that built from 1 bell to 8 before resetting and beginning again, marking not the hour in the way a landsman would understand it, but the steady, unbroken progress of each 4-hour watch toward its end. For everyone aboard, crew and passenger alike, this bell became, over the weeks of a long crossing, something closer to a heartbeat than a simple timekeeping device. A sound so constant, so embedded in the rhythm of shipboard life, that sailors of this era often reported, upon finally returning to land after a long voyage, a strange, persistent sense of disorientation at its absence, the silence of a world not governed by that same steady, half-hourly pulse feeling, paradoxically more unsettling than its presence had ever been at sea. It is this soundscape, water, timber, wind, rope, footsteps, and bell, layered together into a single, continuous auditory environment, that filled the hours of the night we have spent these pages exploring, the same soundscape that had accompanied this family, this captain, this able seaman, and this anxious young man through every one of the 5 weeks already completed, and that would continue, largely unchanged in its essential character even as the ship's circumstances varied from calm to gale and back again, for every remaining night of the voyage still ahead of them. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of comfort even in its most frightening moments. Proof, audible and constant, that the ship was alive, working, responding to the sea around her exactly as she had been built to do, carrying her passengers and crew forward, hour by hour, bell by bell, toward whatever waited for them on the other side of all this water and all this dark. It is worth understanding, too, how a captain like ours came to possess the particular, almost intuitive skill that allowed him to sense the coming storm hours before any clear, objective sign announced it, because this skill was not innate or mysterious, however much it might have appeared so to a passenger watching him from a respectful distance. It was the product of an oral, experiential tradition passed down across generations of sailors, refined through countless individual voyages, and built from an accumulated body of practical knowledge about wind, sky, and sea that, while never formally codified into the kind of scientific meteorology a modern audience would recognize, nonetheless represented a genuinely sophisticated body of observational expertise. Experienced mariners of this era learned to read an enormous range of subtle environmental signals, the particular shape and movement of clouds, distinguishing the high, thin streaks that might signal a change in weather still a day or more away from the lower, denser banks that warned of more immediate trouble. The color and clarity of the sky at sunset and sunrise, a tradition of weather lore, red sky at night, certain kinds of halos around sun or moon, that, while sometimes dismissed by modern audiences as mere folk superstition, often reflected genuine, empirically observed correlations between specific atmospheric conditions and the weather that typically followed them, correlations that generations of sailors had tested against their own hard experience long before any formal scientific understanding of atmospheric physics existed to explain why these patterns held true as often as they did. They learned to read the swell itself, the long, underlying rhythm of waves that often originated from storms still well over the horizon, their direction and size carrying advance warning of whether the ship had not yet encountered directly, a kind of early warning system written into the ocean's own surface for anyone patient and experienced enough to learn its language. They learned to read the behavior of seabirds, the particular quality of the wind against exposed skin, even, some experienced sailors claimed, a kind of accumulated half-conscious sense for barometric pressure changes that preceded their own ship's barometer, where one was carried in registering the same shift. This body of knowledge was transmitted almost entirely through direct, hands-on apprenticeship rather than formal instruction. A a ship's boy, over years of sailing alongside experienced officers and able seamen, absorbed this accumulated wisdom gradually, through repeated exposure, correction, and the slow, patient process of watching weather develop again and again until the patterns became, eventually, almost second nature. It was, in this sense, not so different from the kind of deep, embodied expertise that any master craftsman eventually develops in any sufficiently demanding trade, knowledge that exceeds what its possessor could fully articulate in words, built instead from thousands of small, accumulated observations that the conscious mind eventually stops needing to consciously process at all, responding instead with the kind of immediate, intuitive recognition our captain demonstrated hours before. Tonight's gale fully announced itself. This same body of generational knowledge extended to virtually every aspect of seamanship that allowed our ship to survive the night we have spent these pages exploring. The practical skill that let an able seaman climb rigging in pitch darkness during a gale without falling, the accumulated judgment that told a captain exactly how much sail his ship could safely carry under deteriorating conditions before the risk of damage outweighed the benefit of speed, the careful, patient habits of dead reckoning that kept the ship's estimated position reasonably accurate across weeks of cumulative calculation. None of this knowledge existed in any single written text that a sailor could simply study and master. It lived, instead, in the living, working community of mariners themselves, passed from experienced hand to inexperienced apprentice, voyage after voyage, generation after generation, refined and tested against the genuinely unforgiving judgment of an ocean that punished error, sometimes fatally, and rewarded accumulated skill with nothing more than the quiet, unremarkable privilege of completing one more voyage safely. It is this entire tradition, oral, experiential, built from accumulated practical wisdom rather than formal scientific theory, that stood, quite literally, between the people aboard our ship and disaster on the night we have spent these many pages following. No single piece of equipment, no single technological advantage saved this ship from the gale that nearly claimed her topsail yard. What saved her was this deep, distributed, generationally accumulated body of human skill and judgment, embodied in dozens of individual sailors who had each spent years absorbing it, applied in the chaos and darkness of a single demanding night with the kind of practiced, almost unconscious competence that comes only from genuine, hard-won mastery. It is worth pausing here to consider how completely this entire world, this elaborate, hard-won tradition of maritime skill, this whole intricate social structure of captain and mate and able seaman and ship's boy, this entire rhythm of bells and watches and dead reckoning, has vanished from ordinary human experience in the centuries since. A modern transatlantic crossing, whether by air or by the considerably rarer choice of an ocean liner, bears almost no resemblance to the voyage we have spent this night exploring. An airplane crosses the same distance our ship struggled across over 8 long weeks in a matter of hours, its position known with continuous, satellite-confirmed precision, its passengers and crew in constant communication with the ground below, the entire journey insulated by layers of modern technology and safety regulation from almost every danger that our 18th century travelers faced as an ordinary, accepted condition of their journey. This is, by almost any measure, an unambiguous improvement in human welfare. Fewer people die crossing oceans today, by an enormous margin, than died making this same crossing in the 18th century, and the speed and comfort of modern travel have opened possibilities for human connection, trade, and movement that the people aboard our ship could scarcely have imagined. And yet something has been lost in this transition as well, something harder to quantify than mortality statistics or travel times. A particular, intimate relationship with risk, with the natural world, with the accumulated skill of human hands and minds working directly against the raw, unmediated power of wind and water, that simply does not exist in the same way for a modern traveler settled into a pressurized cabin 35,000 feet above the same ocean our ship once crossed at sea. Level, entirely at its mercy. What allows us, across nearly 3 centuries, to reconstruct a night like the one we have just spent these many pages exploring, in such close and particular detail, even without a single named, documented voyage to draw the story directly from. The answer lies in the patient, cumulative work of historians and archivists who have spent generations piecing together the broad, general texture of 18th century maritime life from an enormous body of surviving fragmentary evidence. Ship's logs, kept with remarkable, disciplined consistency by captains and officers across thousands of individual voyages, recording wind, weather, position, and the ordinary daily business of running a ship, customs and port records, documenting cargo, manifests and passenger lists with the careful, bureaucratic thoroughness that colonial trade regulation demanded, surviving letters and the occasional full journal kept by literate passengers or crew members, offering rare, invaluable glimpses of individual, subjective experience amid the otherwise largely impersonal documentary record. Indenture contracts, preserved in colonial archives, recording the specific terms under which thousands of young men and women like the one in our story bound themselves to years of labor in exchange for passage, and the slower, more painstaking work of maritime archaeologists, who have recovered and studied the physical remains of wrecked vessels from this era, confirming and refining historians' understanding of how these ships were actually built, equipped, and provisioned. From this accumulated mass of fragmentary evidence, historians have been able to reconstruct, with real and well-supported confidence, the general patterns of life aboard an 18th-century merchant vessel, the watch system, the diet, the navigational practices, the social hierarchy, the genuine dangers and genuine small comforts that define this experience for the hundreds of thousands of people who lived it. What remains permanently lost in nearly every individual case is the specific, particular texture of any single person's specific experience. Exactly what the wife in our stories hold actually thought, lying awake during a specific gale on a specific night in a specific year, exactly how the captain's voice actually sounded calling orders through a wind that has not blown in nearly 3 centuries. This story has tried to honor that gap honestly, building its particular details, the family, the indenture contract, the broken yard, the storm itself, not from any single documented account, but from the broad, well-established patterns that historical evidence makes clear were genuinely, repeatedly true of voyages like this one, while being careful never to claim a level of specific, documented certainty about any single individual's exact experience that the surviving evidence simply does not support. This is, in its way, the central tension that runs through any honest attempt to tell the story of ordinary people in history, the desire to make the past feel immediate, personal, and emotionally real, balanced against the historian's and storyteller's obligation not to invent false certainty where the actual evidence offers only general pattern and probability. We have tried, throughout this account, to walk that line carefully, building a story that feels true to the documented texture of 18th-century Atlantic crossings, while remaining honest about the fact that its specific characters and specific night are a careful, evidence-based reconstruction rather than a single, documented historical event. There is one further dimension of this isolation worth dwelling on before we move toward our final close, because it touches something that a modern audience, accustomed to instantaneous communication across any distance, may find genuinely difficult to fully imagine. The complete, total severance from news and contact with home that an Atlantic crossing imposed on everyone aboard for the entire length of the voyage. In the world our characters inhabit, a letter was the only mechanism by which news of any kind could travel between England and the American colonies, and a letter, like everything else, traveled no faster than the ships that carried it. This meant that the family in our stories hold, having said goodbye to parents and siblings on departure day, had no possibility of learning anything further about those left behind. No word of illness, no word of death, no word of any crisis or joy that might unfold in their absence, until they themselves reached land and could begin the equally slow process of exchanging letters across the same ocean they had just crossed, a process that might easily add several more months before any actual news in either direction finally arrived. For the duration of the voyage itself, and for a considerable stretch of time afterward, every person aboard existed in a kind of suspended informational isolation that is almost impossible to fully replicate in any modern experience short of deliberate, extreme disconnection, entirely cut off from any knowledge of events at home, entirely unable to send word of their own safety or progress, simply gone, from the perspective of everyone they had left behind, until the ship itself, or a letter carried aboard some other vessel making. The same crossing finally brought news one way or the other. This isolation cut both ways with particular emotional weight for parents like the ones in our story, who carried, alongside their fear for their own immediate safety during the voyage, the separate, quieter grief of knowing that their own parents and siblings back in England would spend these same weeks not knowing whether the ship carrying their children and grandchildren had arrived safely, had been delayed, or had been lost entirely somewhere on the crossing. A mutual, simultaneous uncertainty that weighed on families separated by this ocean in both directions, with no possible way to ease that uncertainty for either party until the slow, patient mechanism of letters finally closed the loop, weeks or months after the actual events they described had already taken place. For the captain and his officers, this same isolation took on a different, more procedural character. A ship's arrival in port, after a long ocean crossing, represented not simply the end of a journey but a genuine information event in its own right. The first reliable news, often, that the receiving port had received in weeks about conditions, prices, and developments on the other side of the Atlantic, carried not through any formal news service but simply through the accumulated knowledge and cargo manifests of whatever ships happened to arrive. Merchants in port towns on both sides of the ocean depended heavily on exactly this kind of shipborne information to make their own commercial decisions, watching for arriving vessels with the same close attention that a modern trader might give to a financial news feed, because the arrival of a particular ship, carrying particular news of prices, harvests, or political developments in a distant colony, could meaningfully shift the value of goods already sitting in a merchant's own warehouse. It is against this backdrop of total, sustained isolation that the small, ordinary moments of community and connection we have described throughout this story, the shared meals, the songs, the Sunday services, the quiet conversation beneath a star-filled sky, take on their full and proper weight. For the weeks of this voyage, the ship herself, and the small, temporary community of strangers and family members gathered within her hull, constituted the entire accessible world for everyone aboard. There was no possibility of news from elsewhere, no distraction or comfort to be drawn from any source beyond what existed, physically and immediately, within the ship's own wooden walls. This intensified both the genuine hardship of the voyage and the genuine, if temporary, bonds of community that formed among people thrown together under exactly these demanding circumstances. Bonds that, for many passengers and crew, persisted in memory and occasionally in lasting friendship long after the voyage itself had ended and everyone aboard had scattered into the considerably larger, considerably more disconnected world waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. It is worth recognizing, too, that the family at the center of this story represents only one thread within a considerably broader and more varied pattern of 18th century migration across the Atlantic, because the ships crossing this ocean throughout this era carried people of considerably more varied origin than a single English family alone might suggest. English emigrants like ours made up a substantial portion of this movement, certainly, but they sailed alongside and were joined in the colonies by Scots and Scots-Irish emigrants from Ulster, driven across the Atlantic in considerable numbers by economic hardship and limited opportunity at home, and by German-speaking emigrants, particularly from the Rhineland and surrounding regions, who crossed in such numbers throughout the 18th century that they came to form one of the largest non-English-speaking populations in several of the American colonies, particularly Pennsylvania, where colonial authorities and shipping records document their arrival across decades of sustained, organized emigration. These different groups of emigrants often traveled under somewhat different arrangements and conditions, reflecting the particular economic and social circumstances that drove their departure. German emigrants, in particular, frequently traveled under a system known as redemption or indenture, a variation on the indentured servitude arrangement we discussed earlier in which a family or individual might depart Europe without having fully arranged or paid for their passage in advance, traveling instead on credit extended by the ship's captain or owner, to be repaid upon arrival in the colonies, either by relatives already settled there or by selling a period of labor to a colonial buyer if no other means of payment could be arranged. A system that placed redemptioners in a position of particular vulnerability and uncertainty, since their ultimate fate upon arrival depended heavily on factors largely outside their own control. This broader diversity of origin and circumstance reminds us that the Atlantic crossing we have spent this story exploring, while grounded in the particular, carefully researched experience of an English merchant vessel and her largely English passengers and crew, represented only one variation within a considerably larger, more varied pattern of human movement across this same ocean throughout the 18th century. A pattern that, taken as a whole, fundamentally reshaped the demographic, cultural, and economic character of British North America, laying foundations that would continue to shape the development of these colonies, and eventually the independent nation that would emerge from them for generations to come. It is worth pausing, too, to consider the experience of women aboard a vessel like this one, because their presence, while real and recorded throughout the history of Atlantic passenger shipping, occupied a particular and often overlooked place within the predominantly male world of 18th century maritime life. Women rarely served as working crew members aboard merchant vessels of this era. The formal roles of sailor, mate, and captain remained, with only rare and notable exceptions recorded across maritime history, closed to women by the rigid social conventions of the time. But women traveled as passengers in considerable numbers, whether as part of emigrating families like the one at the center of our story, as wives occasionally accompanying merchant husbands on business voyages, or, less commonly, as the wives of captains themselves, a small number of whom are documented across this era as having actually sailed alongside their husbands on a more or less permanent basis, sharing the captain's relatively private quarters and, in some recorded cases, developing genuine practical knowledge of navigation and ship handling through years of direct exposure to their husband's trade. For women traveling as ordinary passengers, pregnancy and childbirth represented a particular and genuinely frightening dimension of the voyage's risk, since the cramped, unsanitary conditions below decks offered little of the care or support a woman might expect during childbirth on land, and the ship's limited medical resources, whatever they happened to be, were rarely equipped or specifically trained for obstetric care. Births did occur during Atlantic crossings of this era, attended typically by whatever combination of the ship's surgeon, if one was carried, and the informal assistance of other women aboard who possessed practical experience with childbirth could provide. A genuinely precarious situation that added one more layer of real danger to the broader uncertainty of the voyage for any woman who found herself, whether by careful planning or unfortunate timing, facing labor somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, weeks from the nearest port and any more formal medical assistance. Our own wife in the hold, fortunately, carries no such immediate concern through the night we have spent these pages following. Her attention fully occupied instead by the more universal parental fears of storm, illness, and the slow, grinding uncertainty of the crossing itself. But her presence aboard, and the presence of the other women scattered through this ship's passenger manifest, reminds us that the Atlantic crossing of this era was never an exclusively male undertaking. However thoroughly the working crew that actually sailed the ship remained dominated by men. Women crossed this ocean in genuinely significant numbers throughout the 18th century, carrying their own particular fears, their own particular courage, and their own particular hopes for whatever waited on the other side, experiences that the historical record, focused as it often was on the more thoroughly documented world of ship's logs and crew manifests, has not always preserved with the same careful attention given to the experiences of the men who actually worked the ship. It is worth, before we close this account fully, imagining one further night aboard this same vessel. Not the dramatic, dangerous night we have spent so much of this story exploring, but an ordinary, calm one, some 2 weeks later, because it was nights like this one, far more than nights of genuine storm, that actually filled the bulk of an 18th century Atlantic crossing, and it would be a disservice to the honest texture of this experience to end our account without giving at least equal weight to the long, quiet stretches of calm that made up the great majority of these voyages. Picture, then, a clear night under a sky entirely unlike anything most modern viewers, accustomed to the persistent glow of artificial light, have ever actually seen. A sky utterly without competing illumination for thousands of miles in any direction, the full, overwhelming density of the Milky Way stretched directly overhead in a band of soft light bright enough to cast faint shadows on the deck below, thousands upon thousands of individual stars visible to the naked eye in a display that, for passengers accustomed to the comparatively dim and limited night skies of even rural 18th century England, often proved one of the genuine, unexpected wonders of the entire voyage. On a night like this, the ship moves through calm water under a steady, moderate breeze, her motion gentle and almost soothing after the violence of the gale we spent so much of this story exploring. The watch standing easily at their stations, conversation drifting quietly between men on deck who, on a night like this, can afford the small luxury of talk that does not center entirely on the immediate, urgent business of survival. Below, in the hold, our family has carried their evening meal up onto the deck itself, as passengers often did on calm, pleasant nights, trading the close, stale air below decks for the simple pleasure of eating beneath an open sky, the children pointing out constellations they half remember from stories told back home, the parents sharing a rare, easy moment of conversation about the new life waiting for them, allowing themselves, for this one quiet evening, the luxury of hope unclouded by fear. It is on nights like this one, far more numerous, in the actual lived experience of an Atlantic crossing than nights of genuine storm, that the voyage's harder edges softened into something closer to the slow, patient, almost meditative rhythm that long sea travel could also offer. Time to think, Time to rest, time to watch a sky no city or village back home could ever fully show, time to simply exist, suspended between one life and the next, with nothing more urgent to do than wait, watch, and trust the ship and her crew to carry them safely through one more quiet, star-filled night toward whatever waited on the other side of all that dark and beautiful water. It is worth, too, considering the ship herself not simply as a setting for this story but as a genuine achievement of human craftsmanship in her own right, because the vessel that carried our characters safely through the gale we spent so much of this account exploring did not arrive on the water by accident. She represented the accumulated product of a sophisticated, highly skilled shipbuilding craft, practiced in dockyards up and down the English coast and throughout the American colonies, by shipwrights whose own expertise had been passed down through generations of apprenticeship in much the same oral, experiential fashion as the navigational and seamanship knowledge we discussed earlier. Building a vessel capable of surviving the Atlantic's worst weather required careful selection of timber. Oak for the structural frame and hull planking, valued for its strength and durability, chosen and seasoned with real care, since green or improperly seasoned wood could warp, crack, or rot prematurely, potentially endangering every life that vessel would ever carry. The hull itself was constructed plank by plank over a carefully shaped wooden frame, the seams between planks caulked with oakum, fibers of old rope, treated with tar, driven tightly into the gaps and sealed to keep the hull watertight, a process that required regular maintenance throughout a ship's working life as the constant flexing and working of a wooden hull at sea gradually loosened even the most careful original caulking. Masts were stepped with enormous care, since a misaligned or improperly supported mast could fail catastrophically under the strain of a gale exactly like the one our ship survived, and the entire complex web of rigging miles of rope, in total on a ship of even modest size, had to be rove, tensioned, and maintained with the same careful, practiced attention that every other aspect of the ship's construction and operation demanded. A well-built merchant vessel of this era, properly maintained, could remain in active service for many years, even decades, her timbers and rigging replaced piece by piece as wear and damage demanded, in much the same way that any well-maintained tool or structure persists through ongoing repair rather than through the impossible preservation of its original materials unchanged. The ship that carried our family, our captain, our able seaman, and our ship's boy through this single demanding night had very likely already survived dozens of similar gales across her own working life, each one leaving some small mark of repair or reinforcement on her hull and rigging, an accumulated physical record of survived danger not unlike the accumulated practical wisdom carried by her most experienced crew members. In this sense, ship and crew mirrored each other rather closely, both built, tested, and gradually strengthened through repeated exposure to exactly the kind of danger this story has spent so many pages exploring, both representing, in their different ways, the same fundamental human project of meeting an indifferent, demanding ocean with whatever combination of skill, craft, and accumulated experience could be brought to bear against it. Before we return, one final time, to the ship herself, it is worth lingering a little longer on the physical and material world this voyage actually moved through, because the abstractions of trade, migration, and history that have run through this story all rested, in the end, on enormously practical, tangible foundations. The actual goods loaded into the hold, the actual clothing that stood between a sailor's body and the relentless cold and wet of an Atlantic night, and the actual instruments that allowed a captain to find his way across an ocean with no roads, no signs, and no fixed points of reference beyond the sun, the stars, and his own ship's compass. The ports that anchored this entire system of trade and migration were themselves remarkable places, worth picturing clearly. Bristol and Liverpool, the two great English ports most associated with Atlantic trade by the mid-18th century, had grown enormously wealthy on the back of exactly this kind of commerce, their harbors crowded with merchant vessels loading and unloading a constant stream of goods. Finished textiles from England's growing manufacturing centers, ironware, tools, ceramics, and a wide range of other manufactured goods bound westward for colonial markets eager for products the colonies themselves largely lacked the industrial capacity to produce. And, on the return voyage, the raw materials and agricultural products that the colonies offered in exchange, tobacco from Virginia and Maryland, packed tightly into heavy wooden hogsheads that demanded careful loading to prevent shifting during the voyage, sugar and rum from the Caribbean trade, timber, furs, and grain from the northern colonies, and a host of other goods that fed England's growing industrial economy and its equally growing appetite for colonial products. Our own ship, loaded in Bristol with a mixed cargo of manufactured goods, would return laden with whatever combination of these colonial products her captain and owners judged most profitable for the homeward voyage, the entire round trip representing a carefully calculated economic enterprise in which passengers, paying their own fares or carrying indenture contracts that represented a separate, additional source of profit for the ship's owners, formed simply one more category of cargo, valuable in their own right, but never the primary purpose for which most of these vessels had been built and equipped. The clothing that protected the people aboard this ship from the genuine physical hardship of an Atlantic crossing deserves its own careful attention, because it represented one of the few real defenses anyone aboard possessed against a climate that, particularly in the North Atlantic, could turn genuinely dangerous through cold and wet alone, entirely apart from the dramatic dangers of storm and wave. Sailors of this era typically wore heavy wool garments, prized for retaining at least some warmth even when wet, layered beneath canvas or specially treated outer garments designed to shed water as effectively as the era's materials allowed, the beginnings of what would eventually develop into the dedicated oilskins of later maritime tradition, achieved in this period through canvas treated with oil or wax to render it at least partially waterproof. Even with these precautions, sailors working aloft during a gale like the one our ship survived inevitably ended their watch soaked through, chilled to the bone, and reliant on whatever dry clothing and brief rest they could manage below decks before the next watch demanded their return to the same exposed, miserable conditions. Hypothermia, though not always recognized or named as such by the medical understanding of the era, represented a genuine and serious risk during prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, particularly for any sailor who suffered an injury or exhaustion severe enough to prevent him from maintaining the physical activity that helped the body generate its own warmth. Passengers, generally less directly exposed to the worst of the weather than working crew, nonetheless faced their own version of this same basic challenge, particularly in the cold, damp confines of the hold, where condensation from the breath and bodies of dozens of confined people, combined with the general dampness that pervaded most of the ship's lower decks, created persistently uncomfortable and occasionally genuinely unhealthy conditions. Families wise enough to anticipate this reality, as ours likely was, packed extra blankets and warm clothing among their limited allotment of belongings, understanding that the physical comfort and even safety of their voyage depended considerably on having adequate protection against a cold and damp that no amount of optimism about their eventual destination could mitigate during the crossing itself. The instruments that made navigation possible at all deserve a final, closer look as well, because they represented the cutting edge of available technology in this era, however simple and limited they appear by modern standards. The mariner's compass, a magnetized needle floating or pivoting above a marked card showing the points of direction, had existed in steadily refined form for centuries by the time of our voyage, but even this seemingly straightforward instrument carried real complications that an inexperienced eye would never suspect. Magnetic north, as 18th century navigators well understood, did not align precisely with true geographic north, and the size of this discrepancy, known as magnetic variation, changed depending on a ship's location on the globe and shifted gradually over the years as well, requiring captains to maintain accurate, updated tables of known variation for the waters they sailed and to apply careful corrections to their compass readings to avoid compounding navigational errors across a long voyage. The octant, a more recently developed instrument gaining wider use among merchant captains by the mid-18th century, allowed considerably more precise measurement of the angle between a celestial body, the sun by day, certain navigational stars by night, and the horizon, enabling the calculation of latitude with an accuracy that earlier instruments could not match. Used together with the log line, the sandglass, and the compass, these instruments formed the complete navigational toolkit available to a captain like ours. Modest by any modern standard, entirely dependent on careful human observation, calculation, and judgment rather than automated measurement, and yet sufficient in skilled and experienced hands to carry ships and their passengers across thousands of miles of open ocean with a degree of reliability that, however imperfect, allowed the entire vast system of Atlantic trade and migration we have been describing throughout this story to function at all. Let us return one last time to the deck of our ship on the afternoon following the storm, before we close this account and let the sea finally settle into the kind of ordinary, unremarkable calm that defined far more of this voyage than any single dramatic night ever could. The sun, fully risen now and unobstructed by the clouds that had gathered so ominously the previous evening, lies warm across a deck still faintly damp in its shadowed corners, the worst of the previous night's seawater long since dried or swept away by the ordinary, returning rhythms of shipboard work. The temporary repair to the broken yard holds steady under a modest spread of canvas, enough to keep the ship making reasonable progress while the carpenter completes a more permanent fix in the relative safety of calmer weather. Men move about their tasks with the particular loose-limbed ease that follows genuine danger successfully survived. Not carelessness, never carelessness, not on a ship like this one, but a kind of settled, grateful competence, the visible relief of people who have tested themselves against something serious and found, collectively, that they were equal to it. The captain stands near the helm, chart in hand, comparing his overnight dead reckoning against the morning's careful celestial observations, adjusting his estimate of the ship's position with the patient, unhurried precision of a man who has done this exact task thousands of times before, and will do it thousands of times again before his own working life at sea finally draws to its close. He does not dwell outwardly on how differently last night might have ended. A slightly worse gust at the wrong moment, a slightly less experienced crew, a slightly less sound hull beneath them all, because dwelling on such possibilities serves no practical purpose for a man whose job, today and every day, is simply to bring his ship and her people safely across however many miles of ocean still separate them from their destination. But the knowledge sits there nonetheless, quiet and familiar, the way it has sat with him through every voyage of his long career. The simple, sobering awareness that the margin between an ordinary difficult night and genuine catastrophe is often thinner than anyone aboard a ship likes to consciously acknowledge. Below, in the hold, the family has found a patch of deck near one of the gratings where pale daylight reaches down into the otherwise dim space, and the children, restored by sleep and the simple, animal relief of a calmer sea beneath them, have already returned to the small, improvised games that occupy so much of their waking hours aboard ship, their laughter rising up through the hatch to mingle, incongruously and rather beautifully, with the steady, ordinary sounds of a ship's company going about its recovered daily work. The wife sits nearby, finally allowing herself the deep, unguarded sleep she could not find during the night itself, her exhaustion visible even in repose, her husband keeping a quiet, watchful presence beside her as she rests. The young man stands still at the rail where we left him earlier, watching the calm water slide past the hull, the storm of the previous night already beginning, in the strange compression of memory that follows intense experience, to feel slightly distant, slightly less overwhelming than it had felt while actually living through it. 3 more weeks remain before this particular voyage reaches its end. 3 more weeks of ordinary watches and ordinary meals, and very likely, at least 1 or 2 more nights when the wind rises and the sea grows rough enough to test the ship and her people once again. He does not yet know what those nights will bring, any more than he knows what waits for him on the other side of this crossing, in a country and a contract he has never seen. But he has survived one such night already, and carries that survival with him now as a small, hard-won piece of confidence, tucked away alongside all his other uncertainties, ready to be drawn on the next time the wind begins, once again, to change. And somewhere above all of them, the same wide Atlantic sky that held last night's storm clouds now holds nothing but clear, ordinary blue, stretching unbroken from one horizon to the other, indifferent, as it always has been and always will be, to the small, determined, endlessly repeating drama of human beings crossing beneath it, generation after generation, in pursuit of trade, opportunity, and the simple, stubborn hope that the other side of all that water might hold something worth the risk of the crossing. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a story like this one as it draws toward its close, and it is worth sitting in that stillness for a while before we let it go entirely, because the night we have spent these many hours exploring was never really about a single storm or a single ship or even a single ocean. It was about something much closer to the center of what it means to be a person moving through an uncertain world, the particular universal experience of lying awake in the dark, listening to forces larger than yourself, and waiting with whatever courage and patience you can gather for morning to come. Think, for a moment, about how many nights like this one have actually happened across the long history of human movement and migration. Not just on the Atlantic, and not just in the 18th century, but across every ocean, every era, every wave of people who have ever gathered what little they could carry and set out toward an uncertain horizon in search of something better than what they were leaving behind. The specific details change from era to era, from ocean to ocean, from vessel to vessel, the technology, the dangers, the particular shape of the hope and fear involved. But the underlying human experience, stripped down to its essential core, repeats itself with a consistency that crosses centuries and continents alike. The vulnerability of trusting your life to forces and to other people you cannot fully control, the particular ache of leaving behind everything familiar in pursuit of something you can only imagine, the slow, grinding accumulation of small fears and small comforts that fills the long, uncertain stretch between departure and arrival, and the profound, almost disproportionate relief of simply surviving one more night intact. Our family in the hold, sailing toward a new life in the American colonies, were not so different in the essential shape of their experience from migrants of any other era who have crossed dangerous, uncertain distances in pursuit of a better future for their children. Different in the specific details of ship and ocean and century, certainly, but bound by the same underlying calculus of risk and hope that has driven human movement and migration across the entire span of recorded history, and very likely across the unrecorded span that came before it as well. Our captain, reading the wind and the sky with skill built from decades of accumulated experience, was not so different, in the essential shape of his expertise, from any master of any difficult, dangerous craft, anywhere in human history, who has learned to read the subtle signs of an environment that offers no guarantees and demands, in exchange for safe passage through it, nothing less than genuine, hard-won mastery. Our able seaman, catching himself on a footrope in the dark, was not so different from anyone in any era who has done genuinely dangerous work because it was the work available to them, and done it with skill and quiet courage because the alternative, doing it badly or not at all, was simply not survivable. It is tempting, telling a story like this one from the comfortable distance of nearly 3 centuries, to romanticize the hardship involved, to turn the genuine fear and genuine danger these people lived through into something closer to adventure, stripped of its real cost and real uncertainty by the simple, comforting knowledge that the story, as we have told it, ends well, with the ship safely surviving its storm and the family safely beginning their new life on the other side of the ocean. But it is worth remembering, honestly, that not every voyage like this one ended this way. For every ship that survived its gale through skill and sound construction and a measure of genuine good fortune, other ships, other nights, other families and crews did not survive, lost to storms, to disease, to the simple, compounding accumulation of small failures that, on a less fortunate night, with a slightly less experienced crew or a slightly less sound hull, might have turned our own story into a tragedy rather than a survival. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, confirms this sobering reality clearly enough. Atlantic crossings of this era carried real, substantial risk, and the people who undertook them, however routine the journey may have eventually felt to experienced sailors making it for the 10th or 20th time, were genuinely gambling every single voyage with their own safety and the safety of everyone traveling alongside them. This is, perhaps, the deepest and most honest tribute the story can offer to the actual people who made crossings like this one. Not to pretend their experience was simpler, safer, or more romantic than it actually was, but to recognize with full and honest weight exactly how much courage, skill, and quiet endurance an ordinary Atlantic voyage demanded of everyone who undertook it, and to recognize that this courage was exercised night after night by people whose names have, in the overwhelming majority of cases, been entirely lost to history, remembered now only in the broad, general patterns that historians have patiently reconstructed from ship's logs, customs records, and the scattered, fragmentary evidence that happened to survive the centuries between their lives and our own. And so, as this particular night finally gives way fully to morning, and as our own account of it draws, in turn, toward its own close, perhaps the most honest thing left to say is simply this: that somewhere on the wide, dark Atlantic, on countless nights across the entire span of the 18th century, ordinary people just like the ones we have spent these hours following lay awake in cramped, swaying darkness, listening to wind and timber and water, carrying their fears and their hopes together through the long, uncertain hours until dawn, and that very few of them ever knew, or had any reason to suspect, that their ordinary, unremarkable courage, repeated across thousands of voyages and hundreds of thousands of individual lives, would eventually add up to something historians centuries later would recognize as one of the great, sustained movements of human beings in history, a slow, patient, dangerous transfer of population and culture, and hope across an ocean that demanded real payment, in fear and risk and sometimes in lives lost, from everyone who crossed it. They did not think of themselves as making history. They thought, most of them, simply of getting through the next watch, the next meal, the next uncertain night, and then the next one after that, one bell at a time, one day at a time, until the slow, cumulative arithmetic of survived nights finally added up to a completed voyage and, for the fortunate majority, a safe arrival on the other side of all that water. There is something worth carrying forward from that simple, unglamorous truth, the recognition that most of history's genuine courage was never experienced, by the people living it, as anything particularly extraordinary. It was simply what the night demanded, met as best as ordinary human beings, drawing on whatever skill and whatever inner reserve of patience and endurance they could find, were able to meet it. If you have stayed with this story through its long, slow unfolding, through the gale and the calm that followed it, through the quiet, accumulated details of life aboard an 18th-century merchant ship, through the particular fears and particular small comforts of the people who lived it, perhaps you have found, somewhere in its telling, something worth carrying into your own night. A reminder, gentle but real, that uncertainty and difficulty have always been part of the human experience of moving forward into an unknown future, and that ordinary people across every era of history have found within themselves exactly enough courage and exactly enough patience to meet whatever the night demanded of them, 1 hour, 1 bell, 1 breath at a time, until morning finally came. The ship sails on, in our imagination if nowhere else, carrying her cargo and her passengers steadily westward across a calm and now indifferent sea. 3 more weeks of ordinary voyage still ahead of her before the coastline of a new world finally rises, for certain this time, out of the horizon. The captain keeps his watch. The able seaman stands his. The family sleeps, finally, undisturbed, in the quiet hold below. And somewhere above all of them, the same vast, patient sky that has watched over every Atlantic crossing in human history watches over this one too, asking nothing, promising nothing, simply continuing, as it always has, to turn slowly from day into night and back into day again, indifferent to the small, determined, endlessly hopeful drama of human beings finding their way, however uncertainly, toward whatever waits for them on the other side of the dark. Sleep well.